Application Security Weekly delivers interviews and news from the worlds of APSEC, DevOps, and all the other ways people find and fix software flaws. Join us as we explore how the latest news highlights modern security practices or reminds us of the missing ones. We also bring insights from interviews on topics from training to threat modeling, from open source tools to cloud-native techniques, plus an occasional reference from new wave to synthwave. Find us at securityweekly.com/subscribe or look for Application Security Weekly wherever you pick your podcasts.
Hey, welcome back everyone to Paul's Security Weekly. Register for an official cybersecurity summit at securityweekly.com/cybersecurity summit. Use the code SECWEEK23 and get $100 off admission. Of course, you can find links to all of my social media, podcast gear recommendations, links to the podcasts I listen to, technical how-to blog posts, and links to my upcoming and previous presentations. You can visit the website, my website, securitypodcaster.com. It's interesting, one of my recent posts, it kind of ties into some content that I want to develop on running Linux on the desktop. And look, I don't think there's any right or wrong answer here. And my recent post is about, it's actually a meme with Indiana Jones. And, he's swapping out the artifact, if you remember the first movie. And it's the artifact is Windows 7, and he's swapping in Linux Mint, right, for grandma's PC. And I posed the question, do you install Linux for your family and friends? And some people, I almost should have done this as a poll. Some people are like, yes, I do. And this is the distribution I use. And some people are like, no, I give them a Chromebook. Totally valid. Some people are like, oh, I give them Mac OS. I give them a Mac. I'm like, that's a valid answer too. Other people are like, no, I like my family, so I don't give them Linux. I'm like, yeah, you know what? That's valid too. Certainly. And I've used Windows, I've used Mac, and I've used Linux as my desktop and daily driver, and I've landed on Linux, and it's not none of those are for everyone, right? Kind of thing. In fact, we were just talking about one of the showing a production engineer about Mac versus. He's like, I could use Windows, but I like Mac. I'm also kind of of the philosophy that I haven't mentioned on the show for a long time. Use whatever tool you're most effective with, right? I would never take away a tool from someone, regardless of what situation that is in, technology or not technology, that they're really good with. I think the most common example is editors for developers or IDEs. If you're really good in VS Code, whatever it is, Vim, whatever it is, if you're really good in that, I don't want to take that from you. I want to support that. From a security perspective, if I'm the security person in the organization or running technology, I don't want to take away your tool. That's what you're good with. We can transpose that, if you will, to martial arts, to sports, to car, whatever it is. If you're good with that thing, I don't want to replace that thing. So I love the responses to the post. I put it out on all my social media outlets, and all the responses run the gamut, and I think it's great. I do want to develop some content about, I really believe, and this might be controversial, but I really truly believe Linux has come a long way as a desktop operating system. I'm somewhat of a testament to that, because I still feel like I have a lot to learn about Linux. I run it every day on my computers, and I still feel like I have a lot to learn. And I think that's a good thing. Sometimes, it can get in the way, and that can be a bad thing. Totally. But I also think it's a good thing because I like having that I always learning mentality, with Linux. So
it's an easy statement to make, Paul, though, because look where Linux has come from a desktop perspective.
It's true.
Well, 0 to 1,000, 1,000 to 10,000. We learned that in the earlier segment.
Yeah, but you're right, Jeff. But also, I've run Windows and Mac OS as my desktop as well, and there's my thought. I guess my opinion is the problems aren't all that dissimilar, right? That you encounter with any desktop. If we limit it to issues you might encounter, I don't think there's a sharp contrast. And again, this is for me. If you've got a totally different role and you're doing different stuff, that you throw everything I say out the window, right?
It goes back to what you're saying about what you're familiar with, what you're comfortable with. I think of the people in my family. If I gave them a Linux desktop, they would struggle simply because they're used to
Correct.
all the things they can do on Windows and all the apps that they can run on Windows. If no other reason than that. It's yes, it's come a long way, but what am I saying? When was the last time I used a Linux desktop? But for people that are used to doing things a certain way and seeing things a certain way, I mean, even just switching from a Windows to a Mac, it can be problematic for a certain generation of people that are just used to doing things a certain way.
But from a security perspective, I had another meme I posted to social media. It's like, when you accidentally download a virus, but you're running Linux, and it's the meme of like, you have no power here. And I just let people go. Like, I wasn't correcting people. Like, I think some people were like, is that a joke or not? And if you follow my social media, it's always a joke. Just throwing that out there. Like, it's always just about humor. And, people were like, well, debating the security of operating systems and malware and stuff like that. I mean, of course, any operating system, Linux, macOS, Windows, whatever it is, it's going to have its security issues. And also malware that's tailored to that, as we well know, right? But I think for, maybe friends and family, a lot of the stuff is targeting towards Windows platforms, right? So you do get that benefit. That's not to mean, like we've talked about this, Larry, I think since the inception of the show, right? Like Macs don't get viruses.
I mean, they don't.
Was a whole, yeah, right? Was like a whole thing. And then Linux doesn't get viruses. Like, dude, no, like you totally... APSEC is important. Doesn't matter what software you're using.
It's a secure operating system. It's so much better than Windows. Come on.
APSEC is certainly important. So that's a little fun from social media.
Yeah. For the record, you may want to reload your show notes. I did add a couple of stories.
Gotcha.
Right before the show.
Ooh.
Yeah.
At least in the behind the scenes BP Works tool. So
Raspberry Pi used to hijack casino card shufflers. Larry and I were talking briefly before the show. I've finally started playing around with some of the other, like in a more serious way, some of the other Raspberry Pi hardware. I think a lot of my Raspberry Pi stuff, Larry, was spinning up to like make little Linux servers to do certain tasks. Obviously, the platform is way more extensible than that. So recently, I've got Kali on a Raspberry Pi Zero, and I've got Pico Ducky on a Raspberry Pi Pico. It's Pico. Is Pico W? I think it's the Pico with the Pico has the Pico also has a Wi-Fi enabled one,
if
right?
I remember correctly, yeah.
I think so. I think both the Zero and the Pico have a Wi-Fi enabled one as well. And the amount of things that you can do with the suite of Raspberry Pi things still astonishes me to this day. And again, like none of this is terribly new. We've known this for a long time. But like every week I find people doing like really cool Raspberry Pi projects and using them for all kinds of things. And like to think that there was a time, Larry, when we were doing the show, when the Raspberry Pi wasn't a thing. Like, what did we do before?
we
used other electronics, right?
Like the Linksys WRT54G.
Yeah, and other smaller electronics. I think it was a lot harder before we had
like the LaFonera routers. And,
and other hardware. It really opened the door. It was just kind of a realization. Like it really opened the door for a lot of this hardware hacking, the Raspberry Pi platform, such that when we go to things that I believe this was presented at Black Hat, right? The Raspberry Pi shuffler.
Yes.
Yeah, this was a Black Hat presentation, and they used a Pi Zero, which I have a tough time finding Pi Zeros right now. I can find the Picos. I can even find regular Raspberry Pis. The Zeros seem to be. I got an original Raspberry Pi Zero from SparkFun. We're not funded or sponsored by SparkFun, right? It's one of the sites you can use to buy electronics, and they have all their own branded like Arduino stuff. Is that? That's their claim to fame. SparkFun's like their own branded Arduino hardware, which is really cool stuff. I was actually looking at it the other day for various projects. But in this case, they use the Raspberry Pi Zero, which again, none of this stuff is new. Like when did the Pi Zero come out?
Before 2017.
Yeah, I want to say it was a 2017-ish time frame, right?
Yeah.
So still a tool in your arsenal. So I guess it's also a call to those getting involved with cybersecurity today. Like, just don't go buy a Raspberry Pi. Buy kind of like the suite of things. So your Pico should cost you around $8. Your Zero should cost you around $15. Am I in the ballpark, Larry?
You are, but there's still some supply chain issues with some of the Raspberry Pi stuff.
Don't pay like $30 or $60, I guess is my public service announcement. Don't go on Amazon and pay $30 for a Pico.
Yeah,
don't do
or
that.
$63 for a Pi Zero W.
Yeah, don't do that.
Yeah, find it elsewhere.
Again, I found some on SparkFun. I don't know, you might have other resources, Larry, to get them. But
let's see. This is the Pico, the Zero, $25 on Amazon. The Pi Pico W, $6 at Adafruit.
Adafruit is another good source. Yep. They've got some in stock. I don't think they had Zeros in stock at Adafruit when I looked.
Let's see. They do. I don't. Raspberry Pi. I have to look at that. Let's see.
So anyway, the card shuffling machine, Deckmate shuffling, IOActive presented research at Black Hat. What I thought was interesting was they had some way to interface with this over USB. Yeah, Deckmate 2 USB interface.
Yep, it has a USB, and effectively you're going to do like a ducky into it to modify the device.
Oh, is that what they were doing with it?
Yeah, that's what I gathered from reading the article.
Okay, which I took it upon myself to teach myself. I didn't really teach myself as kind of makes it sound grander than it was, but it was very easy for me to go from I've never done anything with a Circuit Python or any of the it's basically there are multiple frameworks similar to Arduino, like Arduino's code that runs on the actual hardware. With the Pico as an example, because there's other hardware that'll do this as well, right? Mm-hmm. It's Python that runs it on the device,
right?
And it was pretty easy to do. Like if you've done some hardware techie stuff and you've done some Python, like I went from basically zero to having a ducky that injected scripts, via a HID device, in not a lot of time. It didn't take me that long, and it was fun. It was cool. But the card shuffling machine, so they can interface over USB, but also the thing I thought was like the hacker part of it that I really loved was that says you don't even have to be a card playing genius to make sense of the Deckmate 2's data because it has a built-in camera for deck verification purposes. IOActive found that the camera feed could be accessed to learn the entire order of the deck in real time. Then they said an obvious cheating method would be stem from this. The visual data could be sent to a nearby smartphone via Bluetooth, with which the IOActive team actually tested. A second person could work in cahoots with the player at the table to signal a decision or strategy. Yeah, kind of similar to how you do this car stealing attack.
Yep. You basically have access to a card counter.
Right. So you can see the deck. That's going to get transmitted to some person that has to like make sense of it, and then they have to like process that to the player at the table to do the cheating, which is actually how a lot of casino hacks kind of work, right? Like there's usually a middle.
They don't want you to have electronics and that type of stuff at the table for those reasons.
So that was some pretty cool research, actually. Did you hear anything else about? I know you were at Black Hat.
I did not.
One of the I think cooler talks that I found coverage to be kind of light for Black Hat.
There was a lot of coverage before Black Hat DEFCON about a lot of the talks. Like there was,
news outlets got this.
A lot of.
This is how it works. Like Inside Baseball.
It seemed to me like a lot more than normal. Like normal would be like, oh yeah, there's just going to be this thing at DEFCON that talks about this card shuffler. But no, like you got details about said card shuffler.
Yes.
Really early, like a week before DEFCON Black Hat happened.
Yeah.
And then it was okay.
So my article comes from like Tom's Hardware, right? So like if you're a large news outlet, you get on the list, and when IOActive, as an example, could be any security research company, goes, hey, we're presenting this at Black Hat. We'll lift the veil. You can see everything. You write your article. And like I want to say, typically the way it works is Tom's Hardware writes the article, then sends it back to IOActive and goes like, "Hey, is this cool? Because we don't want to leak too much because we want people to attend the talk. We don't want to leak the research. There could be disclosure issues with the vulnerabilities in there potentially." And IOActive goes, "Yep, that's cool. You can publish it or make this modification or whatever."
To me, it seemed like this year there was a lot more leniency in that. allowing folks to talk about more of the technical details.
Yes.
Prior to
I wonder if that's related to the fact that Black Hat seemed to really cut back on the amount of media passes they gave out this year.
That's where I was going, Jeff. Like Larry and I both for 18 years have read all of the security news and talked about it on the show pretty much every week. This year, I can say, I'll say, I won't speak for Larry, but I can say that the coverage for what was being presented at Black Hat Defcon was like, usually there's a lot more buzz about what's being presented.
Yep. Because I think that buzz came out early. Go ahead, Jeff.
I've gotten the media pass for Black Hat for, the last 6 or 7 years. Thanks to Security Weekly.
Yeah.
And when I got there, I showed up on Monday because the registration was open for Black Hat, even though I was really going to B-sides. And when they checked me in, they were like, "Oh my gosh, it's a press person. There's not many of those this year. We've got something special for you." And all they were giving me was the ribbon that went at the bottom of the badge that said press. And I'm like, that's it. But I mean, they seemed like, again, I don't have any numbers to throw by it, but we know from experience that we had several people on the crew and on the team that were initially granted. Should we say this out loud? I don't know. They were initially. I think we should. They were initially granted access to media passes and had them pulled. Like the Thursday or Friday before going out to Black Hat, which seemed kind of
sucks.
I also think that. And this isn't anything that's not public. Black Hat is owned by a media company. I forget which. It's been Jeff Moss created it initially.
Right.
Was it sold to UBM first?
Something like that.
That you could go back.
It's been sold a couple times, I think.
You can go back and kind of, it's all public, right? Knowledge of what's transpired. But Black Hat is part of a larger media organization. And my guess, and this is Paul speaking in my opinion, that they're like, oh, we have it covered. Like, we're a media organization. We're doing this conference. Our media is enough. And this year, I don't think that was the case. I think what we saw was largely what Larry was referring to as specific news outlets got the scoop on research and talks directly, not through Black Hat. So,
well, it's possible, but I mean, there was no shortage of the media PR requests that I was getting this year, and probably half of them, if not more, were an invitation to, they always ask for embargo. So they agree that they want you to write the article ahead of time, but don't drop it until we actually make the announcement.
Yeah,
which will be at Black Hat. And that I've not seen, and I've never taken them up on that particular offer. But I don't know that there's a loop where you have to submit what you're going to say. I mean, they usually give you in the email all the quotes, all the references. They give you access to whatever the research is, whatever their official press release is going to be. So you've got everything that you need to put into, they assume I'm a journalist. But even those that knew that, that I'm a podcaster and were hoping that we would cover it on a news segment such as this, they pretty much give you everything ahead of time of what you're going to say. So I'm not aware of there being an approval process once you do a draft. They just want you to agree to, don't say anything until we actually drop the actual announcement. And then they expect you to have that full feature-length article with all the quotes and diagrams and pictures and everything all ready to go at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's why I like what Haroon and company is doing at Thinkst in, I believe it's a quarterly publication that they put out. I forget what they call it. But you go to the Thinkst website, you'll find it. They do a quarterly summary of security research, right? They go to all the conferences, but they don't go to all the conferences, but they review the research that has been presented at conferences. They take like their picks from it and they do like a little write-up in like also like why it's significant. And I think that's important because I think there's a lot of research that I've pointed back to that has been presented at Black Hat and Defcon in previous years that I'm like, wow, that's really relevant. Even like today, it's still very relevant to what I'm researching, and I don't want to see that just get swept under the rug, right? I also don't want to see a big splash, maybe make a big splash of it, and then it's kind of, gets swept under the rug. I think it's important to keep that stuff relevant, and in conversations that we're having as security professionals when we're assessing risk, basically, right? I think it was the Tesla hack was certainly, that was one that was, like we covered last week, there was a shining example of that. The research on the voltage fault injection was presented at Black Hat Europe in 2021. And you had to be kind of astute to go, wait, one of the researchers from Berlin, it was the University of Berlin, it was the same research group out of Berlin. One of the people who did that, was part of that research team, was part of the team that did the Tesla hack and used the voltage fault injection and basically spent 2 years building on what they did in 2021 to go, oh, I can use that to hack a Tesla, because Tesla's, if you call it an ECU, is it an ECU? Would you call it an ECU?
Sure.
Yeah, for lack of a better term. The ECU runs AMD processors, so if you do voltage fault injection, conceivably you could use that attack. So the first presentation was the theoretical, somewhat theoretical. I'm sure there was some practicality of it. I'm not sure what level of practicality 2021 AMD voltage fault injection research was, but they put that into use to attack an actual product. I thought that was pretty cool. That was one of my, if you want to talk about takeaways from Black Hat, that was one of my big ones. I thought it was pretty cool. Make it practical.
Just for the record, Sam came up with it was MOSL sold to UBM and UBM sold to Informa.
Informa, thank you.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you, Sam.
Some fast Googling in the background.
I mean, we talked a lot about hardware hacking last week. I had Dr. Doug and Sam Bound. We talked a lot about that, but I'm going to continue a little bit on that theme. We mentioned the card shuffling machine that was presented, but also it's interesting, I think, to look at the reason I liked this article, and Larry, you had this article too about JTAG hacking the original Xbox, was it can serve as an example and the example in the process that you use to attack something at a hardware level that you could apply to other things. And even though it's an original Xbox, right? Future iterations of the Xbox introduced even further hardware protections. And I think that, when Darknet Diaries aired the episode about the gaming industry and how they protect their intellectual property and protect against piracy, and how they look at their customers as both the customer and the attacker in the adversary in that example. I think there's two sides to that story. That monetarily, if you're a gaming company, protecting the intellectual property and the security of your hardware is integral to your business model. I don't really fault them for that, right? Like, we're in this kind of like tug of war. Like, yeah, we want to play cool games, and we want to you need there to be enough money and incentive for people to make cool games. Right. So people go buy cool games. If everyone can just pirate a game, it erodes the entire industry.
Right. There wouldn't be no industry.
Then people wouldn't make cool games, right? We wouldn't have cool games to play.
I would guess that too. I know that I don't do a whole lot of gaming, but I know people that do, and there's all sorts of sites and Discord channels where they talk about cheats and clues to get further in the game. I would guess that a good portion of people that are into that kind of stuff might also want to gain access to free versions of the gaming software.
Oh, of course.
And do other things.
Right. And, and a lot of this, Jeff, I don't know if you've read, it was my story number 4. Larry, I don't remember which.
It was my story number 5.
Typically, there's a cryptographic key, Jeff, that is or a series of keys, right, that it's basically cryptography that is protecting both the platform and the integrity of the game, so that you can't just copy a game, and so that if you do manage to copy a game, you can't run said game on that platform, because basically crypto, right? Larry, Jeff, I'm like not way off here.
Nope.
If a 30,000 foot view of game cracking and security of gaming systems, right?
30,000 feet. Yes.
Yes.
I'll give you 29,000.
29. All right. 29,000. Certainly. But this post talks about, so the original Xbox, it is a really cool story about the original Xbox. Like there's a whole story there, certainly, about the original Xbox. Because I remember, was it Mech Warrior? It was some game had a buffer overflow exploit that allowed you to modify it.
There were a couple.
There's a couple that, and also there was people, as Dark Knight Diaries was describing, right? Desoldering the flash chip, modifying it, and soldering it back on was a very valid method, and often faster than other methods.
Yeah, and then there was the mod chips, which were effectively soldering or adding an add-on board to replace the default flash and shorting the original flash to ground so it wouldn't boot. So
yes.
the other one.
So rather than taking the flash chip off,
you were
modifying it, putting it, you added a second one that was effectively acting as the flash chip and just disabling the other flash chip. I didn't know that's actually how it worked. That's pretty cool.
Yep. Now, of course,
isn't that called a bypass?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, well, I mean, they're bypassing the boot process, right? They're basically a lot of the goal is to bypass the boot process.
Yeah, and also from what I understand too is that Bunny's work made that possible because he was able to recover the 512 byte boot ROM, which they could add to that additional component, or be able to re-sign the bootloader effectively.
Right. Yeah, it kind of comes back to...
Or bypass the signing altogether.
It's similar to secure boot, but Intel secure boot bypasses that we've talked about. It's definitely in the same family, I will say.
Yeah.
This one, though, used some really amazing methods of hardware hacking.
Right. Initially, the amazing method of hardware hacking was that Bunny had to effectively sniff the secret ROM using an FPGA on the hyper transport bus as it left one processor going to the GPU.
Because there has to be we'll talk about this actually in another story about the physical access devices. And Jeff, you'll appreciate this as well. At some point, you have to share a key or transmit a key
over some method.
In your context, Larry, in a lot of hardware, I mean, I remember doing hardware hacking classes with like Liston and stuff, and talking about sniffing the bus because the key is transmitted over that bus if you can sniff the bus. And there's all kinds of different protocols that transmit data over buses over the hardware. You can sniff that, you can get the key. It's the premise to a lot of these hardware-based attacks.
And the speed and the complexity of the bus that he had to sniff to gather that was just insanity.
Sometimes they're slow and it's easier. Sometimes it's a ridiculously high speed and it makes it more difficult.
Right.
And I capture that in my 29,000 foot view.
And arguably, in this case, probably not as well documented as some of the others. Like something like JTAG.
But it underscores the fact that in modern digital, computer-oriented cryptography, and even a few years prior to that, the algorithms and the crypto itself is hardly ever broken. It's all, the weaknesses are in key distribution and key management. Steal the key.
Correct.
I mean,
correct.
I was at NSA in the late 80s, and there was a famous espionage case, Walker Whitworth. Walker was like a Navy something or other, and he'd been stealing the keys to the U.S. systems for years and selling it to the Russians. And ironically, he was getting away with it for like a decade. And the only way he was caught was he was going through a divorce, and his estranged wife blew the whistle on him.
Yeah. I remember that story. Larry, I had a question. He says in this article, a custom CPU interposer PCB.
Yes.
And he describes what it is. And I read it and I can't regurgitate exactly what that. So that sounds really cool.
So effectively what happens with the Xbox, the easiest way to get the key would have been to do JTAG.
Yep.
But
so you're basically a debugging interface, which allows
debugging for the processor.
It allows you direct access to the hardware.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. But what Microsoft did is they tied the reset line for JTAG to ground so it would be deactivated. But they tied that to ground underneath the processor.
Oh, so they tried to neuter it.
Right. And the processor is a ball grid array, meaning it doesn't have the nice little pins that stick out of the side.
Yes.
They're all underneath
the CPU.
And you have a little ball of solder that solders it too.
Okay.
The processor. So
not like when we put a processor on a motherboard and we're building the PC and it has pins that go on the thing. Or actually now it's not pins, right? It's just contacts.
Right.
Yeah.
It's very, very similar, but soldered onto the board. But
solder in the devices, it's soldered
non-removable.
So you have to desolder that.
Right. So that's a
hot air gun to melt that solder.
Yep. And then you can remove it, and then you've got to clean it up.
You've got to clean the solder off of the chip
and the board.
Okay.
And you've got to put all the balls back on the board and make sure that they're all the same size so that when you push it down, it doesn't.
Yep.
They all contact and don't squish out too much and cause a bridge.
Right, and cause a short, essentially. Right. Yeah. Okay.
So effectively, what the author did was created a board that went between the board and the processor. The board being ball grid array soldered to the board.
Yep.
And then the processor being ball grid array soldered to the board.
But with one slight modification, that JTAG ground was
removed. And all the other JTAG ports broken out on the little board itself. So we had direct access to the Intel x86 JTAG.
Yep.
Without it being tied to ground. So
and that's to pull data off of the process, because we think of the processor as just
you could get it from whatever's on the JTAG bus.
But there's essentially flash storage on the processor itself.
Yes.
Right. Like in Intel processors, they store stuff like keys and other things on the actual processor, which is, by the way, not like widely documented in a lot of systems, right? Exactly how that works.
Some other challenges that made this very difficult is Intel's JTAG is not well documented and quote highly proprietary. But
no comment. I think that's where I have to say no comment.
But there were some devices for interacting with Intel's x86 JTAG, but they were custom devices from Applied Microsystems corporations, and they were limited in their sales by Microsoft or by Intel. Why do I keep saying Microsoft? And the default price in 2002, when this was a thing, was between $9,000 and $40,000 US.
Wow.
Nowadays, they show up on eBay very infrequently for $25 to $75.
And this is the what? I'm sorry, I missed
the proprietary JTAG interface.
Oh, okay. Really?
Yeah.
No, that's interesting.
Yeah, and that's arguably the time from the original attack to now, what really made this special JTAG debugger from Applied Microsystems available and affordable, because it went from minimum $9,000 to high price of $75.
Wow.
Big in 20 years.
That's crazy.
When you can actually find one, because they don't show up very often. And it also requires a host computer to be running a Pentium 2 or a Pentium 3.
Wow.
So, yeah, I mean, I can find those at my local
This is also
recycling.
also an academic exercise.
Absolutely.
The original Xbox, like you said, was released in early 2000. So,
Yep.
Again, I think you should bookmark this, flag it as a method that you understand. Like we learn from history, we learn from people applying things like this to older things.
Yes.
Like I can see this when we talk about printers. My printer story, or a NAS. Was it a NAS?
It was a NAS.
Was it? No, it was. Sorry. It was a Lexmark. My story number 10.
Oh, I thought it was 9.
9 is cool too. But while we're on the subject of hardware and stuff like that, it's a Lexmark's command injection vulnerability. This was found by Horizon. Yeah, Horizon 3.ai. whose research team is amazing, by the way. We covered some of the research in the past, and they bought these Lexmark printers. I don't know what, like somewhere in a security research meeting at this company, they were like, we should buy some Lexmark printers. Like, which ones would be good to buy, and we should do some security research on them. And I just want to say that, like, I love those conversations, and that they happen and then come to fruition with research. And so one of the funny parts is they say when the printer finally arrived, it looked like it'd seen better days, and like the glass is all smashed on the printer of one of them. But what they did was they bought two, and the other one they bought, I think, was in much better shape. So they said, well, if we're going to start ripping apart the hardware, for lack of a better term, we'll do it on the one that's already damaged. And the section that says firmware extraction, this was the most interesting to me. So the strategy was to extract the firmware from a sacrificial printer and hope that the keys contained within were able to decrypt the most recent firmware. So firmware is decrypted. Your strategy changes once firmware is decrypted. It goes to, I got to find the keys to what encrypted the firmware in the first place. So they have to dump the decrypted firmware from the flash, right? Because at some point, firmware has to be decrypted, right? We talk about all these mechanisms for protection. It has to run at some point in the decrypted, like at some point, firmware has to be decrypted with a key.
Right.
And so as an attacker, you're like, I want to find it once it's been decrypted and recover it once it's been decrypted, or
and where is that key typically, Paul?
Typically it could be on the flash chip somewhere in a different region.
Yep. Or on a different separate SPI flash.
Or within it could use a TPM system.
Not likely on a printer. But
not likely on a printer because of the cost.
But it's probably all there is what I'm getting at.
Yeah. Correct. Yeah. On other systems like BMCs, some BMCs have their own TPM as an example that they use for key management basically. And I don't pretend to know exactly how the TPM works. There's all kinds of different keys on the TPM. Refer to my post on Eclipsium's blog on the Keys to the Kingdom blog that I wrote that talks about the different key stores on a TPM. Like there's keys to unlock other keys basically on TPM. Did I get that right, Larry?
Sure.
Jeff? Yeah. Attestation key, that's one of them. So back to the printer. So then they go, we want to dump the decrypted firmware from the flash. So they followed an excellent blog post by NCC Group. This is what I love. So now you can take a timeout from this post and you got to go read the post from NCC Group.
Yep. Oh, and then
that is from February of 2022, bypassing software update, packaging encryption, extracting Lexmark MC3224i printer firmware part 1, which again, it kind of goes to my previous point of like, research shouldn't be lost. We should be building on the research, and they've done this. And in this post, they talk about soldering onto a serial header, and then they desoldered the flash chip from this printer and put it on a reader. And so they use that research from NCC Group, and then they said to start finding the keys to decrypt the new firmware. They followed another post from Clarity's Team 82, which is Clarity's mostly a ICS security vendor, also has a research team called Team 82. And that post was not about the hardware, but about how do you decrypt or reverse engineer the firmware from a printer whose model was pretty close to what they had, so they could use that as a solid basis. And then they proceeded to, I'm assuming they didn't show it, but they desoldered the flash chip from the damaged printer, read that flash chip, read the firmware off of it, then used in other posts that had done previous research on it to reverse engineer the firmware, all to get to vulnerabilities. So then they found vulnerabilities within the firmware itself. So cool.
Recovered the RSA key so they could decrypt it. And
were these vulnerabilities, I didn't read into this article, were the vulnerabilities that they ultimately discovered ones that were exploitable without going through all this
Correct. Yeah. Then
Yes.
it's basically a way to get to the software that runs the device, Jeff, to then go find vulnerabilities that you can then exploit without having to have physical access.
Yep, they found command injection.
So they're exploiting the security through obscurity, basically.
Correct.
Yep, they found command injection in the fax trace settings in the CGI bin directory, where a bunch of eval commands were being used.
And Larry, have you done much of like reading flash chips? I talked about this in a blog I did.
Yes.
Which this is a good point to highlight that blog I did on Eclipsium's site titled My Favorite Things, Hardware Hacking and Reverse Engineering. I talk about, what was the tool that...
Bus Pirate?
No. Maybe I didn't include... There was some stuff that I didn't put on the list. It was Dediprog Spy Flash Reader. There's a couple different Spy Flash readers out there.
Yeah, there's a ton of them.
There's a ton of them, right? If you're doing serious security research or penetration testing, penetration is a security evaluation of a piece of hardware. Right.
I'd say nobody's going to pay for this kind of effort in a
unless you have
might be surprised.
But unless you have a product, Jeff, and you're like, I want to make sure my product
very few companies would.
But it's more of a product security thing, right? Where I have this product, the product is going to be physically owned by the consumer. Therefore, I have to make sure that the security is sound for this device. So I want to give it to a security researcher like Larry, who's going to go, well, I'm going to desolder the flash chip. I want to put it on a reader. And there's a couple different ones out there. The name escapes me. It was a Dediprog. Does that sound familiar?
I've never heard of that one before. But of course, I can't find a link to your article either.
There was another one that I referenced in there too, of the hardware being used for that. Maybe it was was it my NAS article that talked about that too? Maybe not. No, it wasn't.
I can't find the post where I put that in Slack either, so I'm just full of fail.
The idea of getting a piece of hardware and tearing it apart and reverse engineering it, that's not new.
No, certainly not.
But it's kind of a lost art in our software oriented world. But back in the day, we were designing systems that had to withstand, and it was an assumption that was made, secure this system, assuming that the adversary has gotten a hold of it and has been able to reverse engineer it, tear it apart, find all the problems, and you still have to secure it.
TNM 5000 from TNM Electronics was the one that they used in the NCC Group one, and I saw another one referenced somewhere. In any case, Spy Flash, a flash reader like that. Yeah, and then
what would be interesting to discover, Paul, is who buys Lexmark's printers typically? Is there a particular market or vertical or segment of the industry that has a contract with Lexmark printers, and that's what they tend to buy? That would be an interesting thing to investigate, to see whether an adversary would go through this effort to find these types of vulnerabilities if they've got a specific target in mind. By the way, I think this is more nation state kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I interviewed the CEO of Horizon 3 last week, and he does have sort of a military background, special operations background.
Yeah.
So we can start to connect some dots. Perhaps.
Yeah, no, they're doing great work there. One thing Horizon 3 says in their article also is they say, unfortunately, both of the printers had toner issues.
This is the best part.
So they were out of toner.
That was hilarious.
Right? And they disabled large parts of the functionality of the printer, including PJL, which is one of the primary interfaces to your printer in terms of a protocol. I've seen like whole firmware encoded in PJL as well. It's very strange. Kind of thing.
I don't care if I don't have a yellow toner. I just want to print black and white. Damn it.
Right. Printer job language.
All I'm going to say about PJL is hijatter.
Yes. Yeah. There's been a lot of security research around PGL. But in any case, I think it's highly annoying that when you're out of toner, and this must be implemented in the firmware, right? The toner cartridge has electronics on it that talks to the printer itself to say, hey, I'm low. And when it gets that signal, it goes, well, I'm going to disable a whole bunch of functionality because I want the user to buy more toner. It's just shady. shit. That's what that is.
And the fact that it disabled a whole bunch of functionality because one of the toner was either missing or low was just...
It's not shady, Paul. It's capitalism.
Yeah, it's capitalism.
Redonkulous.
Redonkulous. That's exactly what it is. All right, so while we'll continue down the hardware front. Let's go to secure facilities, OSDP. This was
sounds like something I heard about in a movie once.
Dan Guden did a great job writing this up. So let's see. Open Supervised Device Protocol, OSDP, is the next generation standard. So, all right. So the next generation mechanism known as Secure Channel was added about 10 years ago to an open standard known as OSDP, Open Supervised Device Protocol. Like an earlier protocol known as Weigand. Is that how you say that? W-I-E-G-A-N-D? Weigand?
Weigand, yep.
Weigand. OSDP provides a framework for connecting card readers, fingerprint scanners, and other types of peripheral devices to control panels. So this is for physical access
right,
devices.
So think card readers and those types of things communicating back end to the door controller.
Right. What I also thought, this is kind of a theme, building on previous research or recognizing previous research. OSDP came about in the aftermath of an attack demonstrated in 2008 at the Black Hat Security Conference. In the talk, researcher Zach Franken demonstrated a device dubbed Gecko, which is no bigger than a U.S. quarter. So you have to put this device inside the device, and it could intercept messages and keys. It would transmit that so you could make your own key to basically bypass physical access controls.
Yep. ESP key and BLE key, same thing.
ESP key, yeah. They talk about ESP key.
Yep.
Have you used ESP key before?
Yep.
I saw ESP key and I'm like, wait, we've covered this before. It's a Weigand interception tool.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, and effectively also replay.
Okay, so someone swipes their badge essentially.
Yep, it'll read it, and you can click a button, and it will replay those weakened signals back on the wire as well.
Mm-hmm.
Not to mention, you have a copy of the data.
Right, to make your own keys?
Make your own cards. RFID cards.
Oh, so this is RFID?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Also, could also have some, I'm almost positive of biometric, but pin-enabled cards as well, or keypads as well.
Okay.
Because those pins are also sent to the door controller over weekend.
Right.
These devices will intercept that and could potentially replay it, or will tell you what the pins are, and then you can click the buttons
so
on
in
themselves.
Response to this,
yep.
So they updated the OSDP protocol to be able to support Secure Channel. Secure Channel allowed OSDP-based communications between peripheral devices and control panels to be encrypted with 128-bit AES, which sounds wicked secure, to use a Rhode Island term. It sounds wicked secure.
Wicked pissa.
It is not wicked secure at all. Where this falls down, and this is research from Bishop Fox.
Oh, excuse me.
Essentially where this falls down is the fix the OSDP developers devised to transmit the key securely, right? Because they had this problem where if you add a new secure access control device, if it wants to transmit key card access securely, right, and validate things over a secure channel, it needs the key that all of the access control devices are using to communicate with the controller. It needs that key. So the developers, when transmitting an SCBK to a new device, the standard encrypts it with a default key known as the SCBK-D. Since the SCBK-D is known to all devices, including the researcher's covert listening device, it's trivial for the attackers to obtain a valid SCBK. So, like, the key used to secure the key is transmitted in the clear. I believe that's what the description of what I just read. That's how I understood it when I read that one.
That would not be PCI compliant.
Yeah, that is not good. So they devised a new attack device called a Melon. Wait. Sorry, go ahead, Larry.
So, so the OSDP developers devise with the encryption, when transmitting the new key, the key to a new device, the standard encrypts the key with a default key
which is on
as SCBK-D,
correct.
default key.
Also known as a seed key.
Right. Yep.
Often same on every device that they're selling to.
Right. But that seed
Everybody.
key in this case is transmitted in the clear. So if you've compromised one of the devices it's basically like it's not a mesh, it's a ring, right? The diagram they have in the article, the topology is in OSDP is like almost like a ring.
Yeah.
Right. So like you just got to snag that key from somewhere. The seed key is basically transmitted in the clear, and that's the key that encrypts the actual key for the usage of the device. Right. Craziness. Poor key management, Jeff. Back to your point. It's usually that the algorithm.
Have I mentioned that doing encryption
hard.
in the private sector is hard?
It's hard.
Or doing it anywhere is hard.
Yes.
And usually where it falls down is in key distribution and key management.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The other thing to note too is OSDP. If you're in the consumer space or you're in a traditional space, most of any of your access control systems are not going to have support for OSDP
because it's a newer protocol. They're mostly weakened.
Will most likely be weakened.
Weakened. I keep saying
it is a new protocol, but new being a relative term.
Well, and when we talk about it in industrial control systems,
it's new like IP6 is new.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's been around for a long time. It's just there aren't nearly as many people using it. And like the Bishop Fox folks said that, you throw in OSDP, but it's not secure by default.
Right.
You think it is.
Yeah.
So there's some more configuration you need to do and some more enablement that most folks don't realize that they need to do.
Craziness.
Yep. Like I can remember, oh God, it was easily 7 or 8 years ago that I took a class with Babak and Deviant at CDI and for physical electronic portion of badge hacking and all that stuff. And OSDP was mentioned, but it was one of those, it's been out there for a long time, but nobody's using it.
Well, because I feel like when you put these systems in for physical access controls, that you do so with the newer technology and newer standards if you're building a new building.
Right.
Oh, we're building a new building. Oh, well, we'll get the latest from the vendor. Hey, and the latest from the vendor is OSDP, right? But like, how often are you building a new building?
Exactly.
Right?
And arguably, you look at, the same thing happens. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Arguably, the same thing happens that we see a lot of times with just the readers, that you go to build a building, and let's say you're not a super secure facility. You're Fortune 1000, Fortune 100. You need some average.
You're a business.
You need an average level of security, and you're going to go throw some HID stuff or some other badge access control system. And you've got the option for the high security one, and you've got the one for the average security one. And the average security one for your building, say, costs $10,000. And the one for the high security one is $40,000.
You got a budget, man. Building a new building is expensive.
Same sort of thing we see.
I've been there. Most of us have been there when new buildings are being built, and we've privy to some of the costs associated with that.
Yep.
This is
same thing. Money. Same thing, even with like tamper detection on the readers.
Yeah.
It has been my experience that most of the readers, the tamper detection is not something on the device and gets sent over the Wiegand protocol. It's a separate pair of wires that are required, and copper is expensive.
Right.
Like you go into build a building and you need 1,000 feet of cable to wire all your readers to the door controller.
The picture
and four.
Go ahead. Sorry.
2 pair wire, so 4 strands is $600. You want another pair to do tamper detection? It's going to be $1,000.
Right. Now, the picture that they have that Dan Gooden has in the article is of the. I came across this on a pen test, and I think when we think about physical access controls, we think about I got a badge in to open a door. Like a regular door with a doorknob and hinges and all that stuff.
Yep.
But the pen test I did way back in the day was, at least for me, the first time that I had seen the physical access controls where there's no door, but they're like when you go in the subway.
Turnstile.
So it was a turnstile security device, meaning people had to badge in.
Yep.
And it would detect if you were tailgating and or jumping over the device. like I want to say in this particular test, I worked with my contact there, and I'm like, does that like really work? He's like, dude, you should test it right now. Like, I'm gonna go to the security guard and like basically give you access to like we should like go test it. I'm like, what happens, dude, if I walk behind someone and I just jump over the turnstile? And like, sure enough, it sets off the alarm to say like someone has not swiped their and that's they call those is it turnstile?
Turnstile, yep.
Yeah, turnstile. That's what it looks like. So I'm assuming that's one of the options that you would get with this technology is that turnstile detection. Which in terms of physical security isn't horrible. Isn't a horrible thing. It's not a bad thing to have, right?
Nope. Like, because I saw the turnstile, I'm like, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hop over it.
That's what I thought too. I'm like, dude, what happens if I hop over?
Does anybody ever try to crawl under? Are the same protections in place?
Yeah, I think there's sensors that detect whether like you're walking through, jumping over, or ducking under. That turnstile, Jeff, is designed to detect someone who hasn't swiped their badge.
But that's when you have to think about, Paul, the world's best hacker movie, which is Sneakers, where there was a temperature control, so they just raised the temperature, and there was a motion control, and they figured out how to move slowly enough to go under the threshold.
Yep.
So you know what I did?
You just have to jump really slowly.
You know what I did?
Right.
But my solution was even simpler than that. Before you had to go through the turnstiles to get to the elevator to access the building, behind the guard desk, there was a conference room, and the conference room had Ethernet plugs, and that's where I put my backdoor device.
I was at a data center one time where there was an adjacent conference room, and all the controls were in the door to the data center.
Yes.
And then there was a side door into the conference room, and there was a second door from the conference room right to the data center.
Yep.
No protections at all.
Yeah. And that's typically how physical access controls are bypassed.
My favorite one, back in the day, Darren and I did data center. Data center was in a hallway. They didn't have a camera, and the data center door had a good inch gap underneath it, and had a motion trigger on the other side to open the door when you're ready to leave. So I took a piece of cardboard, a warm washcloth stolen from the hotel, and Johnny Long style, wave it under the door, and
so you triggered
click.
the re-entry sensor. Yeah, open the door. Yep.
Click. Yep. But I mean, there was literally a 1 inch gap. Underneath the door.
Right.
My favorite one was a colo that had every tenant had their own cage, and they had roofs on the cage and everything. But the door to go into the data center cage on the inside to get out was a push bar.
Right.
And it was a wire mesh.
It was cage.
It was a cage. Yeah. And there was like an 18-inch, steel panel across the bar. I just took my belt off and just stuck it down in the top, popped it right in.
Yep.
The host was not happy.
No. They get very upset when you like ridiculously I would say that a lot of the physical access controls is like a ridiculous bypass. I mean, in other
and they're usually really obvious if you just stop and think about it. It's like an escape room.
If you watch any like Deviant's presentations, like he goes through all of that stuff, and his trainings and all that stuff are amazing. I mean, Deviant's an amazing person, and oftentimes these physical bypasses are exactly the way we're describing. They're just really hacking by just thinking about things differently, right?
I quick one on the physical security side while we're on this tangent a little bit. So when I was in Vegas, I got some targeted Facebook advertisements, and it was for a very large provider in Las Vegas that said, hey, if you're part of Black Hat or Defcon crowd, come reserve an opportunity to come tour our data centers. And I'm like, well, crap, the last time I was there, there was no concept of getting a tour. In order to get into the building, I had to drive up to a gate rimmed with razor wire, get out, walk up to the door, and hold on the intercom. I had to hold my ID up so they could use the super high resolution camera to view my ID while I was outside. Then they let me in the building, and then I had to go through, check in at the desk. And behind the desk were security guards armed with AR-15s. And then I had to go through a man trap.
Right.
And here they are giving tours to the public.
I just want to give a plug to Darknet Diaries, episode 134 with Deviant Olaf. and it's amazing stories. But also Deviant describes all of these stories, and not just the targets are discussed anonymously, obviously, but the people that he's working with on the red team side are also discussed anonymously. And I think many of us know people so well that we can
extrapolate.
I'm like, you know what? I bet you when you were on that test, you were with that person, right? I'm not going to say who I think Deviant was with, so I think, for me and many of us listening to that, you'll also kind of play that game as well, which makes it even more interesting. But it's a series of stories, probably 4, maybe 5.
Did he mention about stealing a golf cart to get around campus?
Maybe. He's got so many stories. This is just like a portion of Deviant stories, right? It's some of the really good ones. So episode 134 of Darknet Diaries is, you have to listen to this. It's amazing. It's amazing. The last one where they're like riding in the trunk and
oh geez.
Oh my God. It was awesome. It was awesome. What's up with the NIST CSF? You guys are both talking about the NIST cybersecurity framework.
Yeah, Jeff, you go.
You guys were both really jazzed about this. I'm not.
I don't know if we were jazzed, but we had just a story to cover.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. I wouldn't say I was jazzed. I can't believe it's been almost 10 years since it came out, because I remember when I came out, I read it, and I'm like, yeah, all of this is in PCI. What's the big deal? So now there's version 2, new and improved, and there's a draft version that they've put out that is open for public comment, which is standard operating procedure for NIST, which is kind of cool.
I'm sorry. NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0 is still in draft.
Correct.
It's in draft. They've released a draft copy for public comment. I actually put the link to the actual draft copy of version 2. It's in my show notes, 6 or 7 or 8 or something.
Yeah, you
like that.
You had 2 stories. One was like a news article, and the other was to the
Jeff story number 2.
I'm going to save you the trouble. Here's the link to the actual CSF. I continuously marvel at the fact that so many organizations in our country and in the world have to run out and find something new and different when PCI DSS is 20 years old now and still pretty much covers all the stuff that all these other things cover.
But Jeff, I don't process credit cards. PCI doesn't apply to me.
I know, that's so tricky. It's so tricky, Larry. If only you could use your imagination and scratch out credit card data and insert research data, customer data, proprietary data,
EPHI.
Whatever it is that you have that you want to protect. All the principles are there.
But Jeff, it says credit card data. I'm sorry, I can't do that.
Here's what I do with these standards, and this is based on some work from my day job. Right, is I go to these standards. Like
this is a framework. It's not a standard.
Right.
It's
so whether it's a framework or standard or guidance, whatever, self-servingly for my day job, I go and I search for the term firmware. NIST CSF 2.0 draft has one mention of firmware in platform security. It says the hardware, software, e.g., firmware, operating systems, applications, and services of physical and virtual platforms are managed consistent with the organization's risk strategy to protect their confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I'd argue that many organizations leave out the firmware.
Have that.
Yeah, they leave out the firmware.
But wait, Paul, didn't you also do that word search on the PCI version 4 standard?
I did, and it said it used the word should a lot.
Should. Yeah.
It was in a category of should.
That.
Yeah, it does that.
Only you need to change is should to shall.
But at least it addressed firmware.
Yeah. It's good to see that it's mentioned, and I mean, Jeff, I think I've some of my work at my day job right now that I'm embarking on a little like research study is based on a statement you made, I think last week or the week before, must have been the week before, that organizations will typically only address some security issue or problem if it's specifically called out in a finding. Now it's a very broad statement, right? And I've been thinking a lot about that, Jeff, because I think that's prolific. I think for a lot of reasons. Self-servingly, I'm relating that to firmware and supply chain. And so my mission is, I'm like, how do I encourage this to be a finding, right? And finding is it's an ambiguous term, right? Maybe that's a penetration tester that points it out. Maybe that's someone in audit and compliance that is pointing out that this is a finding that you need to address, right? I kind of go back to my early days of security when we had audit and compliance, and they pointed out a bunch of findings based on activities and interviews and reviews they conducted, and we had to address those findings. I'm kind of on a mission to go, I want this firmware thing to be a finding so that we have to address it.
Yeah, it's funny that you kind of frame it like that, Paul, because, in the early days of commercial consulting, pen testing, vulnerability assessment, back when I started doing it in the late 90s, we as a community were very often accused of breaking into things to demonstrate, the vulnerabilities, whether we were doing it under contract or not. But I mean, my response to you directly for what you were saying is, I don't think that's good enough. I think most organizations, I use the term loosely, most are not going to respond unless there's an actual breach out there that either happens to them or somebody in the world that's close enough to their industry using the same types of things that they take up and pay attention. Unfortunately,
I agree, Jeff. That's the other side of it, and I agree. And I agree. I think that the threat has to be there.
The threat has to be there because, I mean, we got root on all of your servers in your database, and we see all your information. Yeah, so what?
Yeah, but I think also
we got domain admin on your entire environment. Yeah, well, so what?
But hold on. I think one of the reasons we got rid of Telnet largely is because it was a finding. The mere presence of Telnet on your systems. Wait. It wasn't because
not a good example, but I know where you're going.
Yeah, I mean, all right, so it's kind of a shitty example. Okay. But hold on, let me play this out. Like, all right, we would do some kind of assessment, pen test, compliance, audit, blah blah blah, whatever it was. One of the findings, really, in all of those activities, for a long time was like, hey, you still have Telnet, and you just shouldn't have Telnet, right? And that was a finding, and it was only because that was a finding that organizations fixed it. It's not necessarily that there was an imminent threat.
It was
Telnet.
A compliance impacting issue, and it wasn't an issue. Telnet is a specific example. There's several requirements where it qualifies as an issue, but most clients that I had weren't going to respond to it until it was a pen test finding.
Right.
And they had to get the clean pen test to get the passing. Never mind, they're not supposed to be doing clear text protocols. Those are other requirements. But technically, Telnet is not explicitly disallowed by PCI if you've got the right kind of workarounds
controls.
For
Yeah, sure.
Compensating controls.
I mean, and most often where I've seen it in the last 10 or 15 years is to, let's say, network devices, routers and switches, older gear where, at some point in my history, the older, I'm not going to name product names, network gear didn't have the ability to be upgraded to things like secure shell. So you kind of had to do Telnet. So then we had to come up with creative ideas of creating a jump server and putting all the security into getting to the jump server.
Right.
And from the jump server, that's the only place you could
Telnet. And I agree, because I think with firmware security, that same scenario plays out. There are certain circumstances where I'm going to point out firmware being vulnerable as a finding. And in certain circumstances, you can totally fix it. In other circumstances, I don't have, because of supply chain issues and what have you, the means to update that firmware. Therefore, we had to do something similar like we did for Telnet when there wasn't a clear path to upgrading to a better secure protocol. And we need those same facilities for firmware. Like, look, if you're painted in a corner and there is no firmware update to remediate that vulnerability, there's nothing you can do. And I'm not saying you should fail because of that. We need some alternate mechanism. But I'm saying the circumstances where there is a firmware update that doesn't impact operations, we should call that out as a finding. And like right now, I think most people are turning a blind eye to things like firmware.
Okay, but here's the problem.
Because their vulnerabilities
you all are talking about findings.
Aren't doing that.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the problem. You both are talking about findings. You're both being reactive. Okay? Now talk about the other side of the equation. Hey, boss, we have a problem with, and I'll pick on Telnet just because it's easy, okay? We have Telnet over here. We shouldn't. We have SSH set up. We have everything set up. We don't need Telnet. We don't need to bother with compensating controls. And they go, what's the probability that I'm going to get whacked or hacked or cracked or smacked through that in the next, say, 6 months? And the problem is that you're like, well, pretty bad. I mean, well, can you guarantee me we're going to get hacked in the next, 6 months to a year if we leave Telnet open? I would say yes, but I can't prove it. And this is the kind of problem that we have, being proactive, being predictive, being I'd like to close these holes before they get found. Okay. And it's interesting to see that the mindset that you have is automatically reactive, because we've never been successful at being proactive.
But Josh, I'm not being reactive. I'm saying that the only condition where a lot of my clients actually do something is when it's a pen test finding. I'm saying they're the ones that are being reactive, because there are proactive requirements in PCI that would prohibit the use or greatly curtail and at face value prohibit the use of Telnet FTP. E-commerce. I've had so many e-commerce clients where they put their inventory, that all the photographs of what they're selling goes on an FTP server because they're updating stuff several times a day. I was talking to a colleague of mine earlier today about how FTP servers routinely show up as a critical pen test finding because, oh my God, it's an FTP server. It's a critical finding. It's a clear text protocol. And the discussion that we were having was, but in a pen test report, you're supposed to be fixing all the exploitable vulnerabilities. And most pen tests that I've seen, they flag the existence of the FTP server. They don't necessarily do anything to try to break into it or exploit it or use it as a point to do any kind of what's the term we use these days? Lateral movement to get further into the network. 25 years ago, you got on the FTP server, you could walk it up, get to the root directory, get all the credentials, get all the passwords, and break into everything. Easy.
Yeah, you could just do that with URL tampering 25 years ago. But I mean, here's the problem. Let's assume that there is not a pen test finding. You're going over their architecture. You're sitting down with them and helping prep them for a PCI audit. Okay. Right. And you say, okay, this looks a little hinky over here. They're like, well, where in PCI it says we can't do that? It doesn't really say that because there's things that are not in PCI. Let's be clear, or I should say, not explicitly called out. Does that make sense? No, bullshit. Try again.
Well, but hold on. The way I understand that is it depends on the interpretation of PCI as to what it is recommended. Like shall, should, must.
There is an element of PCI that's extremely subjective, and the person that's supposed to be the ruling interpreter is the QSA, which is what I do.
Right.
The very first thing that shows up that says you can't use Telnet is in your architecture of your network, you're supposed to limit access to only the protocols that are required for conducting business, and you're not supposed to use insecure protocols. That's in requirement 1. Mm-hmm. So in requirement 1, you should be not using Telnet because it's a clear text protocol known to have issues. The pen test is way down in requirement 11. Requirement 2.
Tell me where in PCI it says that it can't use either. Let's see. I can't use AI. I can't use Chat GPT in my cardholder data environment. Where is that spelled out explicitly in PCI?
It's not.
Explicitly. It's not. Okay. So then we're done. There are things that are not explicitly called out in PCI. Period. No, Jeff. Done. There are things that are not explicitly called out in PCI. Period. End of fucking story. Okay, now, Josh, wait. I'm not done. I'm not done. I'm not fucking done here. Wait a second.
Where's the popcorn?
There are things that are not explicitly called out in PCI.
I got drinks.
You're going over their architecture diagram. You say you have a call out to Chat GPT, a free version, not even the enterprise version, here in your architecture. They're like, yeah, well, that's how we get our rates for whatever. Okay, cool, no problem. I get that. But you're like, that's really, I understand what you're doing, but that's really insecure. That's a problem. And they go, well, where is that explicitly called out in PCI? And you're like, well, it's really not. Okay, so what, they go, okay, well, look, tell me how I'm going to get hacked through that. Now, you can give them a half a dozen ways, probably more. But at some point, they can say, no, we're not doing anything about that. You're wrong. It's not explicitly called out. Fuck off. Am I wrong? Yes. Until the QSA shows up. No, I'm not. Until the QSA shows up and says, I'm doing the audit and I do not accept that, they do not have to touch it.
So
if you're the advisor, they don't have to touch it.
The discussion started with Telnet, and I stated there is nothing.
Come on, be flexible.
In PCI
be flexible.
Hold on. I just want to throw out the Chat GPT example is weird. Just saying.
It is weird because I don't.
No, it's not.
Is there any compliance?
Do you know how many financial institutions are using AI?
NIST doc. Is there anything that says don't use Chat GPT today in any framework, regulatory standard, NIST document anywhere? Is there anything that says don't use Chat GPT?
I will answer that slightly. There is a NIST AI risk management framework. There is a Singapore AI risk management framework.
Is it explicitly stated that you can't use Chat GPT in the risk
for PCI? No, it doesn't say that.
No, in the NIST risk framework. In the risk framework you just cited.
I said, hang on. I said I'm answering this slightly.
I think this is a straw man.
Paul, you got the popcorn?
At us.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is there are technologies that are not explicitly called out in PCI. They may be included as a subjective incident of that or subjective piece of that. And I agree with you there. I'm not disagreeing with you. But when you're talking about the mindset of a C-suite executive, okay, who is not a security professional, who does hold the purse strings, all right? And you're like, we need to fix this and this and this, because these are the problems that I see on advising you about what it will take to pass PCI, to pass SEC, to pass whatever, okay? And they go, tell me the probability that I will get hacked through any of those things. And we go back to what I said earlier, which is being proactive. And you're like, I don't know. I can't tell you the probability. Is it high? Fuck yeah, it's high. Is it guaranteed? Fuck no, I can't guarantee shit in this world. Okay? And they're like, well, then I'm not touching it. And until the QSA shows up and says, are you out of your friggin' mind? This is wrong. Fix this and this and this. The three things that you called out earlier. And you're like, haha, told you, jackasses. But you do not have, and we do not have, you do not have the power to tell them to fix it as an advisor. And as an industry, we have a problem. But we can't predict.
I disagree on that, Josh, because I'm not an advisor. I'm an assessor, and I have all the power because I'm the one.
As an assessor, yes, you're correct.
I'm gonna be the one that signs off on them being compliant or not. So, all QSAs are not created equal, and I would say I'm a little bit of a unicorn in the QSA world. But if you're doing something that I think is wrong, I'm not going to pass you. We're going to figure it out.
Agreed.
Now,
you're a straight-laced son of a gun, and I respect what you're saying immensely. Please don't misunderstand.
No, but I just want to point out that I think that it's almost like a double-edged sword for PCI. There's like a good side and a bad side, but in the terms of the assessor part of the story that we're telling for PCI right now, I think it could be a positive thing, such that if there is a merchant that has integrated Chat GPT, the assessor can help quantify the risk for that and make a decision. That it doesn't all fall on the standard and go, oh, I don't know, like maybe that's a bad thing, maybe that's a good thing. Like, I don't know, maybe we should use it, maybe we shouldn't. At least they have guidance from a qualified assessor to help them in that scenario, right?
So I'll throw down a challenge, Josh. You and I can do some homework. Josh, I ask you, what are, give me some examples of definable, I got to use my terms right because I harp on the right. What are definable vulnerabilities associated with the use of Chat GPT that could lead to exploitation that ultimately impacts risk? But things that are wrong with Chat GPT that could be exploited by a threat actor that could yield a bad result, which is what the risk is all about. Give me a couple concrete specific examples. I will find that in PCI DSS for you because I would say it's all there. Okay.
You put input into ChatGPT on a free account, and therefore it gets added to the training data. Assume that some idiot Jimmy down the way in accounting or whatever, throws an entire customer database in there and says, "Hey, ChatGPT, can you tell me what's weird about this data?" Guess what? You just had your entire data set added to the training data, which means that intentionally or unintentionally, maliciously or innocuously, that data could be extracted from that training data by a carefully crafted or unintentionally carefully crafted query. Okay, that's number one. That is a massive vulnerability.
I didn't mean we were going to do it on the fly, by the way. I meant this as a homework project.
Can you?
But on your specific example, there's probably a half dozen PCI requirements that this person even having
violated,
access to that data,
right?
You violated in order for them to be able to do that in the first place.
How about the fact that there are financial institutions currently using ChatGPT? And by the way, I'm using ChatGPT as a placeholder for any generative large language model type of thing. So it's not just ChatGPT; it's all of them. But
most financial institutions are not subject to PCI. Next.
Who the fuck said PCI? This is regulatory. Anyway.
All right, moving along. All right. So, but now we're...
All right, keep going. I'm sorry. This is fun, though. This is fun. This is where I'm enjoying myself.
I felt like we relived Security Compliance Weekly, which I thought was a great show, by the way.
It was a great show. Thank you.
I agree. I think it was... Jeff, I thought it was a fantastic show.
I think we should bring it back, but,
Damn straight.
What does my opinion mean these days?
I mean, we should bring that back after we bring back supply chain.
To put a bow on it, Paul, what you were saying was there's things that go on that people should fix, and the struggle that we all have experienced is how to convince our clients to fix the things that we know are significant issues. And how do you do that in a consistent, reproducible way that takes into account likelihood, probability, business vertical, market, whatever, all the different factors, which are all elements of a risk equation. And in theory, organizations that do PCI are supposed to be doing a risk assessment. And now in version 4, they have the opportunity to have a lot more latitude if they do what PCI has coined as a phrase, a targeted risk analysis. If you don't want to fix your medium level findings in your vulnerability scans, fine. In the old days, you didn't have to ever fix it, medium, low, whatever. Now PCI says, no, you have to have a plan for fixing them. 90 days, 180 days, a year, 2 years. But whatever you come up with, it's got to be based on a targeted risk analysis. It's got to be real. You have to put some thought into it.
So what I'm advocating for is not the extremes, right? I don't want PCI or any other kind of standard guidance, however we want to I've been phrasing it as GRC/compliance to encompass this whole thing. I don't want to see any of those standards, guidelines, frameworks, whatever, to say you got to patch everything right away, or you don't have to patch anything. The answer is obviously somewhere in between. What I want it to be inclusive, self-servingly, because I feel like there is a certain level of risk with firmware. I want to see it be inclusive of firmware. So when they say your software should be up to date, I think that should also include firmware. Now I'm saying every piece of firmware on every single system has to be up to date 100% of the time and patched within 24 hours. Well, no, that's not reasonable or even feasible for a lot of organizations. But I want to see it be on the radar, and I want to see it be part of the strategy for these various compliance frameworks, regulatory compliance.
I think it's important, and in the history of hackerdom, and I shouldn't use that term, exploitation of the computer internet age. There's a pretty consistent track record that the bad guys, the attackers, are going to do whatever's easy and convenient. When all the other things are fixed and they get around to going after the firmware, that doesn't mean that they don't target specific companies, nation state, APT, and all that kind of stuff. But they're not there yet in PCI. But what is the number one firmware related product in PCI? Pop quiz, Paul.
Firmware related product?
In the PCI world.
Card reader.
Is it a
point of sale?
Payment terminal.
Is it like a network
point of sale
appliance?
terminals,
Is it like a network appliance, like a firewall as well? Or?
No, it's the payment terminal. It's the card reader. It's where you're presenting your credit card, which historically is not even a device that's on our radar screen as a PCI QSA, because historically it's an ancillary device that's plugged into in the old days it was a serial port. Nowadays it's a USB port. I could never fail a merchant if they weren't using PCI approved payment terminals. That's a fact. I could point it out to them, but I couldn't fail them just because they were using crappy hardware when it came to card readers. But I mean, I don't want to give anybody ideas, but that's especially given that in today's world, everything's moving to cryptography. Everything's moving to encryption at the point of the introduction of the card, whether it's a tap or a swipe or a dip. That device is doing some sort of encryption, which magically obviates the merchant because they're seeing encrypted data that they can't decrypt. They're obviated from doing a lot of the PCI requirements because that data is encrypted. They can't decrypt it because they don't have the key readily available. It goes all the way through to the gateways and the processors and the third-party service providers. They're the ones that decrypt it and send it on to the card brands for authorization. Guess what's the targeted device these days? And guess what's the most common target for these devices? You're not going after the crypto, skimmer attacks, add-ons, intercepts, and the target attack from, it's been 10 years almost, the Home Depot breach. They were harvesting data, credit card data, one transaction at a time, in the time where it was being transmitted in things that weren't regulated by PCI because it was inside the trusted network. So the paradigm is changing, and I think you're absolutely right. We're not there yet in the PCI world, and I'm glad the firmware is being mentioned because we're going to get there eventually, because more and more and more and more the merchants out there are using payment terminals that have the encryption, so they're pretty much off the hook for PCI compliance. But somebody's on the hook for PCI compliance for producing those devices in a secure manner and in a manner that can't be exploited. I hope I'm not giving attackers ideas right now.
Right.
But that's the prime target in the future.
I want to go back in history a little bit. You mentioned card skimmers, which reminded me that we didn't talk about the MBTA.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Subway hacking, right? Not the sandwiches.
So for the record, MBTA stands for Mass Bay Transit Authority.
Yeah, Massachusetts Bay Transit Authority.
So Boston Metro T buses, all of those.
We covered this story in 2008.
We covered a story in 2008.
Yes. And it'd be interesting to actually go back in the Wayback Machine. It would be a lot of work. It'd be interesting to find our original coverage of this because I'm sure we covered it in 2008.
We did.
So 15 years ago, the Defcon, so I'll read from the article because Wired did a great job of writing this up. It was very well written. The Defcon hacker conference in Las Vegas was hit with one of the worst scandals in its history. Just before a group of MIT students planned to give a talk at the conference about a method they'd found to get free rides on Boston's subway system, known as the MBTA.
Or the T.
The MBTA sued them and obtained a restraining order to prevent them from speaking. That was a popular thing in the 06, 07, 08 timeframe. Thankfully, things have gotten a lot better since then. Talk was, in fact, canceled, but now before the hacker slides were widely distributed online and detailed exactly how to do that.
So that particular talk, the researchers figured out how to hack the Charlie card. The Charlie card
back then was a Magstripe?
Magstripe.
It was Magstripe.
My understanding is that it was a stored value Magstripe.
On the card.
On the card.
On the card itself.
Yep. So the value was stored on the card itself.
So wait, that's like a series of 18 digits or something like that?
Something like that, yeah.
That's stored in the Magstripe data.
And typically there's no encryption or encoding on a Magstripe anything.
Correct.
Yeah, it's just a way.
But who could read it? It's a Magstripe.
It's a magnetic storage device that stores a series.
I remember it was 8-track readers. Yeah.
Yeah, it stores basically a string.
Right.
Typically a series of, usually it was a series of numbers. If I remember correctly, the Magstripe is usually a series of numbers. in this.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be any series of data.
Mostly zeros and ones, but through the magic of ASCII, they can
extrapolate that out.
Back in the day when this happened, the original one that they got sued for, it was relatively easy to read magstripes. You could find magstripe readers very inexpensively.
In fact, I know some people that had readers and writers.
The trick was finding a writer, because I acquired one.
Yes.
And we had to do a bit of social engineering to be able to get one, because you needed to prove how you were getting one.
Well, I conspired in this.
Yes, you did.
In this plot.
Yes, you did. I do believe when I stated to the company that we were looking to start like some place where you needed a membership to be able to gain access, so we needed to program the cards, and they said, well, we need to speak to like a supervisor, and you were
I was the supervisor. I think I had to give my federal tax ID. We had to prove we were an actual company.
Yep.
Like there was hoops to jump through to get a magstripe writer. Largely, we're going to go back to PCI. Largely, actually, solely because of credit card fraud and theft in this arena, bred the bars and regulations and red tape you had to go through to get something that could write. If you wanted to buy it legitimately, as we know now, you could buy magstripe writers on we don't call it black market. What would you call that?
Dark web.
The dark.
AliExpress.
It wasn't the dark web.
AliExpress.
But before AliExpress and before the dark web,
eBay.
Yeah, you went on some underground forum.
You
went on the internet and you talked to shady people who were essentially criminals, and you said, "Hey, I want to buy a magstripe writer," and they're like, "Oh yeah, great!"
You went to Radio Shack. Remember Radio Shack?
Could you build one at Radio Shack?
Absolutely.
Interesting. Well, so some people built them from Radio Shack, and then shady business happened, and they sold them to people. Yep. Larry and I did the above board thing and said we're an actual company.
You know why? Because we actually wanted software that was going to work.
Yeah,
and we wanted a device that was also supported.
In our defense, our intent was not to clone credit cards and commit fraud, right? Our intent was to do security research. So we didn't tell the company that our intent was to do security research. We told them I don't know what we made up some lie about what our intent was.
It was something about a member. It was something where we needed to have membership and gain access to a facility. Yeah, like if you wanted to get access to the Paul.com studios, and yes, it was Paul.com at the time. I don't owe you $5.
Yeah, right. But our intent was to not use it in a criminal fashion. So I was like, yeah, Larry, let's do this.
And the sad part is, I think I can. I think I can put my hands on that reader to this day. Right. I think it's in my office.
You must have the writer somewhere.
I mean, the writer. Yeah. I'm almost positive I do, and I think I know where it is, because you know those Sterilite shoeboxes.
Mm-hmm.
I have the writer in the Sterilite shoebox, and I want to say it's still there, because I still populate that shoebox with magstripe and RFID cards from hotels all over the place. Yeah. And like that box is jammed full, and I can't get stuff in it anymore.
If only I had known you guys back then, I could have saved you a lot of trouble, because imagine going to a convenience store, any kind of retail store, where the point of sale, which is the cash register, what we used to call it in the old days, it was a PC, and the PC had a monitor, and the card readers like on the top of the monitor, or it could even be a separate attachment. But that thing was connected on a serial port, and it was just communicating straight ASCII, and all you had to do was hover your mouse into any field that was text writable, and you could read the card.
Right. We were talking about getting a writer.
Right. So moving along into the modern attack.
So modern attack, they summer of 2021, 15-year-olds Matty Harris and Zachary Bertocci were riding the Boston subway, and they were talking about a Wikipedia article that read that they had observed this moment in hacker history. In 2008, it was a big it was a pretty big story back then. So they're like, well, riding the subway, they're in Boston, and there's also, just like sidebar, the hacking scene, if you will, in Boston as it relates to MIT goes back, oh good lord,
long time
into the 60s. I mean, you could trace back hacker culture in MIT and in the Boston area into the 60s, right? So that
where was Robert Morris a student?
It was very nostalgic. Robert Morris student was Robert Morris was a student.
I think he was
at MIT?
University of Florida. Was it MIT? I thought he was Florida.
No, he was. This was a trivia question.
I'm literally reading
Hacker trivia.
It wasn't when he did the Morris worm. It wasn't MIT. He wasn't at MIT. He was at MIT after. I think he is still an MIT professor today. But when he did the Morris worm, it was a trivia question that I used to quiz people at conferences. It wasn't MIT because I thought it was MIT. It wasn't. Anyway, we'll fact check that later. But
Harvard.
Was it Harvard?
And went to graduate at Cornell.
Cornell. He was at Cornell when he did the Morris worm. Yeah. So anyway.
Yep. It was at Cornell with the worm. Yeah.
When I read the story, I had those same thoughts in the back of my head about the whole background in hacker history. So they assumed, fast forward to today, that from 2008, if researchers were basically sued or the injunction against them to not present this research, that from 2008 to now, the stuff must be secure. Right, like they've had all this time to make it secure. So skip to the end of the story. It's not.
Right. It's updated the technology. It uses RFID now.
It uses RFID now.
Yep. It uses an RFID, and I remember where I saw it, but it does use a little bit of a different standard of RFID, and the data that's written to it is protected in very limited fashion, but it is still stored value cards. Like the value of the card is stored on it.
I wish off the top of my head I could explain roughly how RFID different standards work for encryption. Larry, I know you know some of that, but Josh, you too, I was trying to clone my card with my Flipper Zero.
Yep.
At a hotel, and I was running into issues. And so I'll give a more recent example. The Flipper Zero struggles with Myfair Classic. Is it Myfair Classic cards?
Myfair Classic.
Yeah, but there's a certain way that they do the implement encryption on there that the Flipper kind of falls down. You need a proxy.
I was going to guess there was an encryption issue.
There is.
Yes. It leverages a standard known as Crypto 1, otherwise known as Crapto 1.
I was reading about. I was in my on a family trip,
not know the Crapto 1.
Reading on my phone,
Crypto 1 requires a key effectively to be able to read protected regions of the card, and there can be two keys to protect those regions. Right. So you could provide one key to one to one access control and another to another.
That's how I can access my hotel room door, but there's a master card that can also access all that.
And so they would technically be different keys. Like you could have one key assigned to the building management company.
Yes.
And then a different key for your office suite.
I've seen this. I've been in situations in hotel where the staff has to let me into the room.
Yep. And they have a master key.
My key or didn't work at that time.
The master key has the clipper chip on it, Paul. That's what it is.
Yeah. And I was like, wow, if I clone that key, basically I can that card, I should say, I can gain access to all the rooms.
So with the Myfair ones, there's a couple of different attacks. One, you just guess a bunch of very common default keys. In the traditional attacks, there's 16 very common keys that get used. The next one is that you're effectively executing a timing-based attack, because with Crypto 1, the keys are derived are time-based, derived by time-based from reset. And you can send an answer to reset command to the Myfair Classic keys to tell it to reset. And
you know what the keys are going to be based on the...
Right. Then the time is predictable, and then you can guess the keys based on that. And once you have that, you can then use what's known as the nested attack. So if you have one key and you authenticate to the card, it effectively unlocks all of the sectors, despite if the other sectors are secured with a different key. So once you authenticate once, you authenticate to every sector, regardless if they have different keys, which you can then use to read the keys out of.
There's a whole lot of history and technical details about cracking RFID.
Come take SEC 617, ethical wireless hacking.
Okay,
yes,
so I was going to add.
But again, Paul, you're not cracking anything.
No. A lot of it is brute forcing.
The algorithm.
Yep.
This is key implementation.
Correct.
Key implementation failures.
Yeah, a lot of it from my cursory look fairly recently a lot of it was brute forcing, and there was some.
And so
I was like researching, and then like I read the card, and then it was like trying to brute force the card on the Flipper Zero.
So,
and the Flipper Zero stuff is kind of
the final.
If you're gonna do this, you want a Proxmark.
So the final one with Myfair Classic with Crypto 1 is they realized that was a problem. Mm-hmm. So they changed the way they derived the key to not be time based, but to actually be random. So it was the randomization.
There's no such thing.
Right.
Go on.
Yeah. So now, what
was it based on? Do you know?
I don't. I could find that out. I'd have to look at some
There's
slides.
like a.
But so
explaining all this
to
would
round that
would
out,
take like it's like probably a day or half a day in your class
quarter of a day
to explain RFID. Yeah.
So the final one is the hard nested attack. You need to pre-calculate all of the possible keys,
right?
Which you can do in RAM if you have enough of it, and then it's
not on your Flipper.
So the way the Flipper works is it uses the key guessing attack with known default keys.
Yeah, okay. That's what I was doing in my hotel.
But instead of 16, the default Flipper uses about 1,000.
Mm-hmm.
The Unleashed uses just over 4,000.
Okay, I have Unleashed on here. So
because I was at Black Hat, Myfair Classic keys to get into the hotel.
Mm-hmm.
And I had both flippers, one with the stock Flipper firmware and one with that. And I tried it with both, and both of them failed.
Okay, so now I don't feel bad.
No, you don't feel bad.
Now I just want to go buy a Proxmark, because Proxmark can have a larger...
Proxmark will either brute force successfully or can do the full hard nested.
Okay. Yep. A full dictionary of all possible companies. All possible keys. Yeah. Okay.
So then what you do is you go and recover that, and then you use that to submit a pull request to the firmware for the Flipper. So you add
once you crack it, you add the cracked value to the 4,000 that's on the Unleashed firmware. I gotcha. Okay, so that makes total sense.
You'd be a good steward.
Thank you.
You'd be a good steward.
Cleared up a lot of things, but that's essentially the premise of the attacks that the new MIT hackers are doing against the Charlie cards that are implemented. I don't know.
So for this one, effectively, what happens here with all those keys? You're using those keys to gain access to data on the card. It's not used to. It's used to encrypt the data on the card with those keys in Myfair Classic. But there's data there, and the data in the case of these Charlie cards determines how many rides you can take and what the value of this is. This also happened back in the day with FedEx, but it was I think also Magstripe. They store the data on the card. So if you know the keys and you can update the value and update this proprietary method that they're using for encoding their data with the checksum, you can change the value, the stored value on your card for free rides.
Now, in this article, it said that they did use a Flipper Zero.
They didn't. Another guy did.
Another guy did, but the MBTA claimed it could spot the clone cards when they were used and deactivate them.
Yeah, which is weird.
Is there a unique...
So there there can be. So they could.
The nature of Myfair, you can.
Yes,
but it's a you can
add
put a fake one in the database and not a red herring, a honey token basically.
Yep.
But nobody does that.
So Josh, I don't remember if Myfair had it, but one of the other Myfair standards, like Ultralight C, has a read counter, so you can tell how many times it was read.
Okay.
So you read it once, you clone it, you read it again, and the backend system says, "Well, it's already been read once, and the read counter is 1." Wait, something's funky here. So that could be that could be one of the ways they could detect.
My other question is the when you're in a hotel, it's time based when your card access expires to your particular room.
Yes.
That's built into the protocol, obviously?
No, that's built into the door controller.
So when they issue my card, it has to send.
It's server side.
Yep,
how does it? But how does it? Does it tell the door controller?
So it tells the door controller likely over Ethernet.
So the door controller is hardwired.
The door controller is hardwired. which then will communicate to the actual lock on the door.
Yep. Okay, that makes sense.
Either hardwired
so there's
or
a whole,
likely RF.
Every door in the hotel is hardwired back to the controller.
Not necessarily. They could be doing the updates over RF.
Interesting. Or there's an RF device like in the hallway that's talking to all the
door controller.
Okay.
Yeah,
there's communication communication between a controller and all the door controllers that
the door locks instead of the door controllers. The door locks. Yeah,
I've experienced this in various scenarios in hotels where like you have to switch rooms, or I've been late to checking out when traveling with family, and then like in the back of my mind while all this chaos is going on, the hacker in me is going, wait, how do they do that? How do they? There's a time they must program and like my gear start turning. So,
hey, can I humbly suggest we shift gears? But we're talking all sorts of crypto and stuff. I did have an NSA related article. I think it's
Go for it. I
think it's my story number 5. I'm curious as to if you guys have any insight into this, but the question that this article posed was, did NSA create Bitcoin?
Well, hold on. My question that just pops into my mind when you say that, Jeff, is what would be the motive for the NSA to create, promote, or support Bitcoin?
I can tell you.
As a means, the hypothesis is as a means to surveil people that they want to surveil.
Interesting.
Yeah,
it's also a great way to make black market money that they don't have to justify or audit or
that's
have in a
the
budget.
CIA. That's the CIA that does that.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I mean, the NSA
Jeff,
could create it and create all that, and then give it to the CIA.
Hold on, I'm with Jeff on this one. Creating black market funds is the business of the CIA. Just historically.
I hate all of you, by the way, because none of you have read the article. Because if you get about
I didn't read the article. I'm sorry.
Into the article, the NSA analyst that they're citing is me. Damn it!
What?
I love it.
So did the NSA create Bitcoin? Jeff Mann, a former NSA cryptanalyst, tells magazine that it's feasible.
Feasible, but hold on.
Gather intelligence and
feasible, Jeff, in that they have the knowledge. They have the brain power.
Yeah,
agreed.
Certainly have done it. That's the guy that approached me for this article, and I'm actually impressed at it's like one of these reality shows like the Al Capone's Vault.
Yeah.
We're gonna get into we're gonna investigate this question. So he provided a lot of research, a lot of the points of view and the theories, and ultimately we don't know. But he approached me, I don't know, a month or so ago and wanted to ask me, since I was an NSA person, and would I be willing to talk about it? I said, sure, I can talk about it. I don't know anything about it. But is it possible? Yeah, there's a lot of smart people at NSA.
I can certainly opine about it, right?
I don't doubt that they could have come up with something like Bitcoin. Would they have? No, I doubt it. I mean, that's my professional opinion. Why would they? Same thought you had, Paul. What would be
why? What would be the motive?
Yeah, but like we were getting down, it probably wouldn't be the NSA. It was probably the CIA.
But I think the motive for creating
the NSA would have been the cryptographers who would hand it over to the CIA. They would have been the people, because the CIA, as smart as they are, the NSA is, no offense to the CIA, smarter. And the NSA would have built the system.
is in the courtyard of CIA headquarters and not NSA headquarters.
Bingo! I rest my case.
Or whatever.
But the way I understand Bitcoin as it was created in cryptocurrency is in direct response to the 2008 financial crash of being independent from other markets, right? And to me, that makes more sense. But to me, that is
a great disinformation campaign.
It is. I mean, it could be. You're right. You're right, Larry.
Right? The conspiracy theorist in all of us can start thinking like, I
don't know. I think conspiracy theory gets in the way.
Dude, Star Wars, like not the movie.
The disinformation campaign.
Disinformation campaign.
But I don't think Bitcoin and cryptocurrency was a disinformation campaign. I really do think it was a direct response to being financially independent. I also think that
much to believe.
If you look at, let's just look at who benefited the most from cryptocurrency. It wasn't any particular government or government agency. largely it was cyber criminals that have benefited, whether it was created with that intention or not.
Cyber criminals.
We can't deny.
And potentially terrorists. And who else but the CIA and the NSA and the FBI would want to know about those types of things and be able to tap into that?
I don't know, but
it's an intriguing idea, and it's actually a well-researched. There's a lot of interesting stuff in the article that I didn't know about. Ultimately, the conclusion is maybe, but it's an interesting article. And
you know what irks me though? You know what irks me though, Jeff, and
what
Josh and Larry is it?
You know what really grinds your gears?
I want to know who created Bitcoin. Like I really really want to know. I'm like in the camp of people that like, I gotta know. Like I understand why secrets exist and the purpose and the value of secrets in a lot of different scenarios, but also I'm like, I just want to know certain things. Like, are there really aliens, and who created Bitcoin? They both fall in the same camp for me, and I don't think in either case we may never get the answer. In my lifetime.
To quote Princess Bride, Paul, get used to disappointment.
I know. I'm very disappointed that I don't have any definitive proof or evidence of who created Bitcoin and aliens.
Well,
it falls in the same camp for me.
60 years.
When I wake up in the middle of the night, this is what I'm thinking. I'm like, shit. Where is the evidence of aliens, and who created Bitcoin?
I mean, 60 years from now, you might actually get somebody to testify before Congress that they know about aliens.
Oh my God!
And can discuss it and classify, right?
Like why on social media? I'm like, why am I seeing all this alien stuff?
Because they exist.
Oh my!
Somebody testified before Congress to say that they do, and they would talk to you about it in a classified scenario.
Yeah,
and I know someone that has written Richard Thiem. He's written the authoritative chronicle of all the UFO sightings and stuff. And I met with him a couple months ago in person, and he said simply, they're here, they're real, they're here, they've been here a long time.
They're here.
The government's frustrated because the technology that they have, they can't catch them. It's so far superior to us.
But you know what though? You know what also I go back to in this maybe relates to security or not, but I got my first iPhone in 2007. And like since then, very quickly, so many people on this planet have a phone in their pocket. And you mean to tell me that we've been visited by people from other worlds and no one's been able to have definitive proof of that? Larry needs a drink now.
Yeah, I do.
I think the easier one, Paul, is time travel. If time travel was possible, we would already know it, because regardless of when it is created or figured out, it would have been done and people would have visited us. Right?
Stephen Hawking held his party for that. He held a party for time travelers and announced it 3 days after.
How many people showed up?
No one except him.
He's the only time traveler then.
Oh boy! All right, let's go back.
We're all time travelers.
Let's go
1
back,
second per second.
Let's go back to cybersecurity for a moment. I just want to. I want to
a brief moment.
A brief moment.
Yeah,
I think we should go back to. I think we should. Yeah, let's go back to Intel Arc GPUs have a hidden security flaw. I just want to debunk this.
Aren't they all hidden security flaws?
Right, until someone finds them, in which case they're not hidden.
So then, if they found this one, would it be not a hidden security flaw?
Look. I really like Tom. I really like Tom's Hardware as a news outlet.
Agreed.
However,
I'm just busting your stuff.
I think in this one they're grossly overstating. They're basically they said after a year-long embargo, the chip maker had finally lifted the curtain's downfall, a vulnerability with costly performance penalties that impacts multiple generations of Intel processors. Look, I work with people that worked at Intel. I wrote the blog post for Eclipsium that talked about our response to downfall. We detected. We talked about downfall last week. Intel is not like grossly negligent in this scenario.
No.
Right? Intel had a very appropriate response. In fact, Intel has very appropriate and timely responses to security vulnerabilities and incidents. I'm just putting that out there. I think that's gross. And now they're saying, so they go on to say, well, Intel had downfall, and now they have these vulnerabilities in Intel Arc graphics cards. Did you know Intel has their own graphics card? I'm really tempted to buy one, by the way. I think it's really cool. architecture.
I mean, I know of Intel graphic stuff, but not like the high end stuff.
So Intel has the Arc series of graphics cards to compete with NVIDIA. They're largely lower priced, and I like they're fully open sourcing the drivers, so they're supported by Linux. I'm applauding this effort. Gamers are kind of on. I don't know. I feel like they're kind of on.
They're
the fence.
supported by nothing.
Well, no, they're supported by Linux, but like
I mean for the game side.
In gaming,
I think that's what Larry said.
In gaming performance,
Redundant.
That kind of thing. But so Intel has done. So here's what I wrote. Intel has done an outstanding job ensuring the security of their platforms, and I will stand by that statement. Right. My one kind of pick on Intel. And I definitely play both sides of this with really large vendors, Microsoft, Intel, and many others included. But my one pick is they talk about remotely exploitable vulnerabilities as privilege escalation. I've talked about this on the show. That's kind of one of my nitpicks on how Intel does it. That aside, Intel does a great job of securing their platform. Right? They've got a harder job than folks like Apple, who controls the ecosystem, right? They control the hardware all the way through the operating system.
And now they really do, because they're not even relying on Intel
makes
processors.
hardware. Intel makes hardware, and they're like, here's a chip, like put that on a board, put whatever software and firmware, here's some SDKs, and does their best to secure
Put it in your laptop, put it in your sex toys, put it in
whatever, and put whatever other chips in front. But they do a great job of and I've personally spoken to people and interviewed people from Intel, and they're really smart and doing a great job. What also this article, I think, they're trying to make a big hoopla of Intel vulnerabilities. I'm like, let's not lose sight of the fact that AMD has also had really bad vulnerabilities in the same classification as Downfall, as an example. Like, let's just look at Inception and the fault injection attacks that they had that were built on. So also these graphics card vulnerabilities, when I looked at them, were largely denial of service.
Yep.
So don't make a big deal where there's not a big deal, I guess. Like I get, like, you run a major news outlet, you're trying to make a big splash and blah, blah, blah. I
agree with you, Paul, but don't underestimate the importance of denial of service. I was having this conversation with someone last week at Black Hat where in reference to the healthcare industry, healthcare.
No, I agree.
Appliances.
Yes.
In the world that I grew up in, the risk was always to human life. And in the commercial sector, it's all about money. Mm-hmm. But the healthcare sector is where we come back more closely to the original intent of data security being confidentiality, integrity, and availability. It's in the healthcare environment. We do care about denial of service.
Right. Availability.
Probably in healthcare, more availability, probably more so than any other industry.
Jeff, I'm going to bring this real timely real quick. If you want to talk about the impact of denial of service, Defcon Saturday night.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's bring that up.
I think Microsoft and the COTSIS vulnerabilities ties to that, but I think we haven't talked enough about Defcon and Black Hat. And it's interesting, when I was looking at I didn't go to...
Well, you weren't there, Paul.
I know, I wasn't there. So I'm following, I'm following on social media.
Yep.
Right.
Defcon was canceled.
I see that our good friend Jim McMurray.
Yep. VetCon founder.
Love Jim. And he was doing VetCon at DEFCON, and
I was there.
Yeah, Jeff was there.
DEFCON shirt to prove it.
If I had attended, I would have been there as well, supporting my friend Jim.
I wasn't going to wait in line when it first opened, but I was hanging around and going to the arcade and that type of stuff.
He did amazing stuff. Obviously, he's been a guest on our Stogie Geek show, and we hung out at ShmooCon.
And I went to his ThreatHunter.ai bourbon tasting the night before.
Well, because why wouldn't you? But anyway, I'm watching this unfold.
Larry and I were hanging out
right?
together.
But I'm watching this unfold, and I'm like,
Paul, you weren't there.
I know it sucks I wasn't there, but also I'm glad everyone was safe. Mm-hmm. First of all, right? And I think Las Vegas also is still to this day, heightened sense of security after previous incidents, of course.
Yes.
With the shooter was that Caesars?
Caesars.
Yeah, it was Caesars.
No, Mandalay.
It was Mandalay. You're right.
You're right.
Yeah,
Mandalay Bay.
So certainly very
which is
sensitive,
where Black Hat happens,
and very heightened. I get it.
Yep.
And when I saw it was evacuated, I'm just thankful everyone's safe. To be honest with you,
totally. it was very interesting to be there.
Were you
for
there?
that.
So where?
So it allegedly the threat was identified to be down sort of in the back hallway in the back corner near the arcade, and that's actually where I was headed when the event unfolded. It was myself and another gentleman were headed out that way. I knew that you could cut through the chill out room to avoid all this mess in the hallway to go out the back door, and you'd be right near the arcade. We went through the chill out room.
It's amazing how much time we spent in Caesar's Palace.
It's not Caesar's Palace. It's the Forum Tower, which is completely different.
Caesar's Forum.
Caesar's Forum. We spent time in both. I mean,
we never spent time in the Forum.
No,
nope. Different.
This is new.
This is new.
The Forum is new.
New Caesar's property.
Oh, interesting.
Yep, completely across the street.
It's
from
a
Caesar's
convention
Palace.
center, Paul.
Okay, I haven't been. I don't know that I've been to it.
You have
other
not
than the
been
Las
there.
Vegas Convention Center. It's the biggest exhibit space in Vegas now, I think.
Yep.
Oh, so I'm used to Caesar's Palace that has the hotel rooms and is connected to the Forum shops.
Correct.
But you're saying the Caesar's
This is the Forum Tower.
The Forum Tower is across the street.
Yes.
What was
behind
across
the Flamingo?
Oh, behind the Flamingo.
Yeah. So we go over to that arcade section,
and that's where that's where DEF CON largely took place. Was in the behind the Flamingo.
Yep. It's a
convention center.
Convention center.
Okay.
So we were headed over out the back door for the chill out room, and they had it closed, and there was a goon.
Yeah.
Doing this.
Waving. Yeah.
Like, yep. Go. You can't go out this way. You got to go that way. So all right, we turned around, went out, and we went to go around the proper way through the hallway. And we got a little bit further down, and a bunch of goons come around the corner like, hey, everybody, we need you to go this way.
Mm-hmm.
And
goons directing traffic.
That
they should do at DEF CON.
Very quickly went from, hey, everybody, we need you to, let's go this way, guys. Everybody, it'd be really cool if you do that to get the fuck out.
Yep. Everyone out. Everyone out. Yep.
Yeah, it escalated.
For your safety, everyone out.
No. Just get the fuck out.
Yep.
Like, we can't tell you why. Get out. And then various law enforcement agencies showed up with a bunch of dogs, and you go, you put two and two together.
Right.
The part for me that was very...
It seems like the response was very well...
It was
executed.
It was appropriate.
It was appropriate and well executed. Okay.
Yep. It was appropriate, well executed, and the couple of and arguably one that sucked a little bit is that they effectively had given the all clear, but they wanted to do additional tests throughout the entirety of the space,
which is what I would gather is a large. If it's hosting DEF CON, it's a freaking large.
35,000 people roughly.
Yeah.
Right. So
square footage wise is a lot.
It's big.
I don't know how big this space is. It's huge. It's bigger than anything you remember from.
Yeah. So what I read was they shut it down for the night in abundance of caution. Did all sweet, and next morning was open.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Well, I would assume it's open. I had to go get a flight.
Yeah, sure.
But disappointing about Saturday night. There was a whole bunch of folks that I was hoping to run into that night, and I couldn't because basically everybody got scattered into the wind. So you either ended up out in the heat on the patio outside the building, or you ended up in one of the other party locations at the Flamingo, the Link, or Harris, because DEF CON also had stuff at Flamingo, the Link, and Harris.
I gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
The villages were at the Flamingo, right? Yeah.
Yes.
They were all over. They were
that's true.
Flamingo, Harris,
Link,
and the Link.
Harris.
Yep.
As there was villages
in the main forum space.
In the main forum.
It's a shame there wasn't a Sky Talks village. Too bad.
Yeah. Yep. I mean, there's some politics there.
Yeah.
And Paul, when was the last time have you been to Vegas? Have you seen the Sphere yet?
I've not. So I'm glad you brought that up. I was listening to Risky Business, and I wanted to talk about this briefly. That I heard I saw the Sphere, right?
Right. The Sphere, by the way, is the new entertainment venue. It's this huge orb.
Yep, for concerts. Concert venue.
But it's basically like a large LED screen.
It's a big dome that's an LED screen.
It's an LED screen. So like the first thing we think of as hackers when
I want to put Goatsy on it.
Look, 30,000 whatever the number
Googly
is. I'm going with 30,000. 30,000 hackers converge in Las Vegas. There is an electronic device that's a giant sphere our first thought is we need to hack this thing. And
absolutely,
what transpired was it was not hacked during that time.
It survived arguably the world's largest free pen test, if you think about it.
But nobody was allowed in the facility. So did it really survive the pen test?
But pen test, it's all about the internet. It should be external.
But if it's all about the internet, it wasn't.
Well,
dependent.
next year when it's open, and maybe we'll have villages in the sphere someday. Maybe that'll be a different story.
Yeah, if it's on the internet, then we didn't need Defcon to pen test it.
Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it wasn't connected to anything.
I don't know. I mean,
it's connected to something.
Connected to something.
Yeah. Unfortunately,
it's too big not to be connected to something.
Yeah, I did.
Also, we're kind of older. Also, it's like permission thing too. Like,
but whatever.
We advise people to not violate the law and have permission to hack things as well.
Paul,
There's
it's
that.
Defcon.
It's Defcon.
Well, okay. So we just forget about the law because it's Defcon.
No, we don't. We don't.
We don't.
There may be a number of Defcon attendees who don't give a fuck.
But I think that's my point, and I want to be very careful with my words because I don't want to insult anyone. But there's a lot of us that have a lot of hacking knowledge that would look at that and go, "I don't have permission to do that." Right. There's enough at stake where, I try and hack that? Sure, I could try and hack that.
Yep. I do not look good in orange, nor do I. I also enjoy going outdoor daily. Paul. Yep.
Right. But a lot of us,
the people that I know that probably would have the chops to actually go after the sphere knew better than to try it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I would argue that there's probably as equal a number of folks at Defcon that have the chops that could go after the sphere that maybe don't care. Or think they're immune.
I agree. I think they fall in different camps. There's that's not something I'm going to do.
Yep.
Like, I'm not getting paid to hack the sphere, so why am I going to hack the sphere?
Right.
And I don't want to say it's all about capitalism, right? But there's multiple buckets you fall in. Like, it's not worth the risk. Like, sure, maybe I can hack the sphere, but if I get caught, that could be bad for a lot of reasons. So therefore, I'm not going to try. Right.
So what I'm hearing you say, Paul, is the hacker methodology from the movie Hackers, where we're just going to do it, sort of took the back row to the sneakers mentality, where no, there's a right and a wrong, and there's a time and the place, and we should get paid, and it should be authorized. I know. So sneakers wins once again.
That makes me really upset when you put it that way, Jeff.
And I did that intentionally, Paul. But
that makes me think that someone should have hacked the friggin' sphere at Defcon.
So while we're talking about, quote, that community,
there's a pool on the top of the sphere.
When we talk about that community, there was you talk about there's a bunch of elite folks that could do it, but wouldn't because of ethics, not getting paid, etc., and legal issues. There's a whole host of elite dudes and ladies that would do it because the lulz.
Yeah.
And they don't care.
In this one instance, Larry, I would say it's probably more dudes than ladies, actually.
Now,
ladies tend to be a little bit
I just want to put gender aside and just call them hackers.
Fair enough.
Yeah, hackers.
So two things that I wanted to comment on that I observed about the community. One, between Black Hat and Defcon, I noticed a significant increase in non-CIS male participants, meaning diversity across all bounds.
Okay.
Whether that be LGBTQ plus,
sure, diversity,
African American, Asian, women, all diversities.
There was people of all ages.
Age. Yep. From high to low. I mean, Jeff was there.
Yeah. I was.
We got the older crowd. Jeff represented the older.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks, Larry. There were people that are older than me.
Yep. The other one that I thought was also amazing is that I know some people. I saw some complaints from people or heard complaints from people like, "Holy shit, these people don't get Defcon," because there were so many new faces.
Yep.
We need to. But hold on. I just want to throw this out there as a statement.
Yep.
We need to embrace that.
Oh, agreed.
Oh, I thought it was beautiful.
And as a result, there was some the behavior was different. People were happy to be there. As an example, 2 examples. There was a stage in the contest area for where Feeks were giving talks, and I don't remember what guise it was under. It was I can't remember the gentleman's name that came on the show, friend Elise, that talked about some crypto or education and crypto, something of the like. Ming Yao.
Yeah.
He was MC for this particular stage.
Love Ming. He's been in our community for a long time.
And he asked of the people that were sitting in this really large space
First
in
Defcon?
chairs, first Defcon, more than 75% of the people raised their hands.
That's huge. That's positive.
Yes.
Yep.
And as a result, with all these new people, haven't necessarily traditionally understand what the culture is about. For example, I was sitting down on the floor
We need to
in the
make them
chill-out room.
realize you need to hack the sphere.
Right. Like I was sitting down. I was sitting down in the chill out room, on the floor, having something to eat because I needed something to eat, and like sitting up against the wall is a space next to me. Some woman comes over and plops her bags down, and hey, how you doing? Good. You enjoying DEF CON? Yeah, it's great. Hey, I gotta get some food. Would you watch my bags? Sure. Like, would you have ever done that at DEF CON?
No.
Exactly.
Never.
She asked me to watch her bags. I'm like, yeah, sure, no problem. She goes and gets some food, comes back, sits down. Hey, I'm so and so. Hey, I'm Larry. How's your DEF CON? It's really great. I've got to see a couple of great talks. I've been talking with some folks about some of the problems that I've been having dealing with some security issues in my town and so forth. And she went on the story and she says, oh, and by the way, it's my first DEF CON. I'm like,
I knew that.
I could tell. Yep. And
but it's our job to coach those and mentor
totally.
those people for sure. Just want to throw that out there. It's absolutely 1,000% our job to embrace those people, but also coach and mentor them.
Totally.
Also, I don't want to lose sight of shenanigans, right? Like the sphere is kind of like I'm on the fence about
the sphere has to be a future target. It will fall
but I'm on the fence about like I don't want to lose sight. I don't want to recommend that people do things that are unethical or illegal, but I also don't want to lose sight of the hacker spirit of shenanigans. And I feel like there should be,
but at the same time,
shenanigans should be very targeted, especially at DEF CON, to be not harmful, leave things as you found them kind of thing, but also some shenanigans as well. I think shenanigans are still very important.
Where is it written down in the DEF CON lexicon that you should put googly eyes anywhere? And I was out at I was getting lunch someday at some food venue, and I noticed, somebody got the googly eyes up there.
But that doesn't cause a lot. But to your point, Jeff, right? That doesn't cause a lot of harm, but kind of speaks to the hacker kind of spirit, right? But also,
neither would turning the sphere into a huge. I don't know what somebody that hacks it ultimately is going to do with it. Turns it into a grapefruit. Turns it into a watermelon. Turns it into
hold on, not Goatsy. It should be like a scene from the movie Hackers on the sphere.
It should be. I mean, it should be a statement. Probably will happen.
Look, it shouldn't be anything grotesque, right? It should speak to our culture in an appropriate manner, right? We are hackers, in here we are, right?
Right, and we did that, and that was the early days of hackerdom. I mean,
but there's also a line, like if you look at the history of DEF CON stories, you got to listen to interviews with Jeff Moss about stuff that has transpired at DEF CON. Right. Some of that stuff, man, is like it's cringe. My son recently asked me, like, what is cringe? He's like, what does it mean to be cringe or cringe-worthy, right? Like that's usually something that's like bad, man. Like it's not cool, right? And you kind of cringe at it. And some of the stuff that's transpired at DEF CON, I'm like, it's kind of cringe-worthy, right? Like it's the one that comes to mind is there were wireless access points near the elevators, and someone removed one. They were all connected via Ethernet cables, and they put it in the elevator. And when the elevator went down, it pulled down all the access points. And technically that might be air quotes a hack. Like don't do that kind of stuff because it's destructive, right? But modifying a screen to put up, there's a display somewhere and you put up a screenshot of the movie Hackers instead of the kiosk.
Turn it into a Rickroll.
For a limited amount of time and then it flips back, like you made your point, you hacked it, you left things as you found it. That's cool. There's a line.
Hey, there is a line. My laptop's going to die any minute now. I want to add, echo what Larry said. What I was impressed most about was I work with people that are like, oh, I would never go to DEF CON. It's evil. It's scary.
No, go to DEF CON.
Those people.
Go to DEF CON.
But I mean, one of the people I work with, they're like, oh, I want to learn how to hack. And I'm like, and I'm walking around DEF CON. You should be here because there's so many villages. And what I was impressed most about, I was getting kind of emotional, to be honest, at Vegas, because I was walking around DEF CON. I'm like, there's so many people here that are just in love with what they do, and they're so eager to share. All the volunteers I tried to hit all the villages just so I could
agree.
say
I like that as a strategy that was my advice to people that went to DEF CON this year, Jeff. Go to the villages. I'm like, go to the villages. They're like, what do I do at DEF CON? I'm like, go to the villages.
Don't go to a talk. Go to the villages. Try stuff out. There's people there.
They have talks at DEF CON?
Yeah.
Eager. Yeah, somewhere they do. That wherever there's long lines, which I try to avoid. But I went to, there was a crypto village, and it was crypto means cryptography village, and there was a young lady that was giving a talk on visionaire squares. And I was watching, I was like, oh my God, they have no idea what a visionaire square is. So I'm like, I went to seek out who's in charge here, because I would love to volunteer. I would be happy to give a talk on origins cryptography and tell you what a visionaire square is really used for. Come to find out that the person that runs the village is the person that was giving the talk.
Oh shit.
So I went up afterwards and I said, here's my little wheel. Here's the visionaire square. This is how it's really used. Oh, by the way, I invented that. And they were like bowing. They were like bowing to me. I'm like, here's my card. Please get in touch. I'd be happy to volunteer next year and give a talk.
Yeah.
And then I started walking.
Oh, there goes his laptop.
Oh. But Jeff,
good night, Jeff.
Yeah, Jeff brings up a good point, though. We need to play those roles in, even a venue as large as DEF CON, right? As mentors, folks that have been there. Keep the hacker spirit alive, man.
Highlight of my DEF CON.
Yes.
Highlight of my DEF CON. I got to spend 15 minutes with Daniel Suarez.
Oh, how is he doing? Man, we interviewed him back in the day.
You interviewed him twice. And both times he was on the podcast, I wasn't here. So it was totally awesome. I got to see. Has he
authored more?
He's got a new one.
He
that
just
came
keeps
out
writing
in February.
Yeah,
and it's it's like the next in a quote a series from what is it? Hyper-V is the one that he recently did. That was the remote the mining of near field asteroids for minerals. Which is totally like out of his wheelhouse. And I got to talk to him about how he goes and develops the storylines and who he gets to talk to, that, like off the record conversations from former government officials and former people at NASA that helped develop like 60 programs. And
he's a great guy.
And not one of them
Daniel's
got picked
a great
up.
guy, and he's a great writer. And what I think a lot of people don't realize about Daniel Suarez is that when we interviewed him the first time, he was like, I've never written a book before, and I just embarked. You totally hacker spirit, right? Like, my God, I've never done this before, and I'm going to go do it. And I'm going to do my best at doing it. I'm going to do a little research, and I'm going to do it. And then I'm just going to keep getting better at it. And Daniel embodied the hacker spirit. I think that's why we fell in love with him in his works, is that he is a hacker through and through, right? He was like, I want to...
Unintended functionality of his own skill.
And he was like, I don't know, I wrote Damon and like, I might have done some. I'm like, dude, no. Like, Damon was an awesome book.
Yeah. So
awesome.
So it was funny. By
the way, that was his first book. And if you're listening to this, you should go read or listen to
Daemon by Daniel Suarez.
By Daniel Suarez.
So for the record, I showed up. I knew where I had some nice folks that I'd met over the years say, hey, Daniel Suarez is going to be at such and such a location to meet folks, and he's not publicizing it, and he's just going to be there. And so I showed up and got a chance to talk with him. And before I talked with him, he was talking to somebody. So I was just wandering around. I was standing there, and these two ladies were talking, and then it sort of became a conversation of three. They started talking about camping, and apparently one of the ladies was his handler. And I just kept talking to his handler and said, "Oh yeah, no, I really want to. I want to meet Daniel Suarez." And I told the story about being on the podcast 2 times and not being there, and I just want to shake his hand to say, thank you for all the works, and I've had great time reading it. And I wish I had something for him to sign, but I don't. She says, "Well, hold on a minute. We have a box of books for super fans."
Oh, nice, dude.
So yeah, I got a book signed by him, and then I ran into him to the next day because I didn't have any challenge coins left. So I ran into him to the next day and gave him a challenge coin. He's like, "Oh my gosh, I love these. Thank you so much." And then we spent another 10 or 15 minutes talking about stuff, and it was awesome.
This is a great guy.
Highlighted my DEFCON.
Oh yeah,
You
awesome.
bastard. All right, done.
Well,
that's a pretty friggin' good highlight, man. That's awesome.
We can't top that. So thank you everyone for listening and watching this edition of Paul Security Weekly. Larry, take us out.
Over and out.